Alright, I want you to think back to a moment, just one moment, where your hand was literally shaking over a phone. Not because someone died, not because you were in danger, because you had to press one button, call. That's it. That's the whole terrifying event. One button. And yet, for so many people, that single button feels heavier than anything else they will do that day. Heavier than the gym, heavier than a hard conversation with a spouse, heavier than public speaking, which, by the way, is supposed to be the thing humans fear most, more than death. But ask any salesperson, any founder, any freelancer who's had to pick up a phone and call a stranger for the first time, and they will tell you that first call felt worse. Here's a stat that might surprise you. Multiple sales training organizations have found that the majority of new salespeople, over 80% in some studies, say cold calling is the single most anxiety inducing part of their job. Worse than negotiating price, worse than handling rejection after the call, worse than quota pressure. The anxiety isn't really about the call, it's about the 3 seconds before the call. That's where the fear lives, not in the conversation, in the silence right before it. And today we are going to take that silence apart piece by piece. We are going to understand exactly why your brain does what it does in that moment, why it feels so disproportionate to the actual risk, and more importantly, what to do about it. Not vague motivational fluff, real practical, psychologically grounded tools you can use today on your very next call. Because here's the promise I want to make to you right at the start. By the end of these next 3 hours, the fear isn't going to be gone completely. Fear rarely disappears entirely, and I'll explain why. That's actually a good thing later. But it's going to lose its grip on you. You're going to understand it, predict it, and move through it instead of it stopping you cold before you even dial. So why does this matter so much? Because that first call, the one you are avoiding, the one you have rescheduled 3 times in your head, the one sitting in your task list with a little red flag on it, that call is usually the hinge point of everything else. Careers get built on the willingness to make calls other people won't make. Businesses live or die or someone being willing to reach out first. And yet, almost nobody teaches you how to actually deal with the fear itself. They teach you scripts, they teach you objection handling, they teach you tonality and pacing, all useful. But none of it works if you can't get your hand to pick up the phone in the first place. Why do people fail at this? Not because they are bad at sales, not because they aren't smart enough or likable enough or prepared enough. They fail because they treat the fear as a stop sign instead of a normal, predictable, and manageable part of the process. They wait for the fear to go away before they act, and it never goes away first. Action comes first. Confidence is the result, not the requirement. So, what will you walk away with today? You will understand the actual neuroscience of why cold call anxiety happens, what's going on in your amygdala, why your brain treats strangers no like a physical threat. You will learn the specific historical and business stories of people who were terrified of that first call and made it anyway, and what happened next. You will get practical frameworks you can use in the next 10 minutes if you have a call sitting in front of you right now, and you will understand something that almost nobody tells beginners. The fear you're feeling is not a sign that you are not cut out for this. It's a sign that you are a normal human being with a normal nervous system doing something it hasn't been trained to expect. Let's start with a story, because I think stories tell us more about fear than statistics ever could. There's a young insurance agent in the 1930s. This is a story that gets passed around in sales training circles, sometimes with the name changed, but the core of it is well documented. Who was so afraid of his first cold call that he sat in his car outside the building for over an hour. He wasn't lazy, he wasn't unmotivated. He had already quit two other jobs because he couldn't handle the fear of rejection. This was supposed to be his last shot, and he sat there, hand on the door handle, telling himself just 5 more minutes, over and over for an hour. Finally, and this part matters, he didn't wait for the fear to go away. He got out of the car mid-fear, heart still pounding, hands still sweating. He walked in anyway, and the first person he spoke to said no. So did the second. But the third said yes. And that agent went on to build one of the most successful independent insurance practices in his state over the next 3 decades. Here's what I want you to notice about that story. The fear didn't go away before he acted. He didn't have some magic and transformation in the car. He got out while still terrified. That's the whole secret hiding in plain sight. And we are going to come back to that idea again and again over these 3 hours, because it's the single most important reframe about fear that exists. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is doing the thing while the fear is still there. Now, have you ever wondered why your body reacts so strongly to something as low stakes as a phone call? I mean, really, what's the actual worst that can happen? Someone says no, someone hangs up, someone's rude to you for 10 seconds. That's it. Nobody's coming to your house. Your safety isn't at risk, and yet your heart rate spikes, your palms sweat, your mouth goes dry, your mind goes completely blank the second someone picks up. Why? The answer takes us back about 200,000 years to a time long before phones, before sales quotas, before LinkedIn messages and cold calls. Your brain, the actual physical structure sitting in your skull right now, was built for a world of small tribes, where being rejected by the group didn't mean an awkward 5 minutes. It meant losing access to food, protection and survival. Being cast out of the tribe was quite literally a death sentence for most of human history. Your amygdala, that little almond shaped cluster of neurons sitting deep in your brain, doesn't know the difference between this stranger might reject my business proposal and this tribe might exile me into the wilderness to die. To your amygdala, a no on a sales call and being kicked out of your ancestral hunting group register as remarkably similar threats. This is why the fear feels so disproportionate to the actual stakes. It's not that you're weak or overly sensitive or bad at this. It's that you are running incredibly old software on incredibly modern hardware. Your phone in 2026 technology, your phone is 2026 technology, your fear response is Paleolithic. There's a mismatch, and once you see the mismatch clearly, something shifts. You stop asking why am I so weak that I am afraid of a phone call, and start asking, of course, a part of my brain is treating this like social exile. That's literally its job. That reframe alone takes some of the shame out of the fear, and the shame, it turns out, is often the heavier weight than the fear itself. There's something else worth understanding here, and it comes from a concept psychologists call threat prediction error. Your brain is constantly trying to predict what's about to happen so it can prepare you for it. When you are about to make a call, your brain runs a simulation, and because it has limited data about this specific person on the other end, it fills in the blanks with worst case scenarios. This is not a flaw, this is a feature. Predicting the worst case and preparing for it kept your ancestors alive when the worst case was an actual predator in the bushes. The problem is that this same prediction engine doesn't distinguish well between a saber-toothed tiger and a stranger who might say, "I am not interested, thanks." But here's the interesting part, and this is where things start to change for you, because your brain runs on prediction, and because it updates its predictions based on actual experience. Every single call you make, good or bad, is data that retrains that prediction engine. This is neuroplasticity in action. The first call is always the worst one statistically and physiologically, because your brain has zero real data and has to run on pure imagined threat. The second call is slightly easier, not because you have become braver in some abstract sense, but because your brain now has one real data point that says, "I made that call and I did not die. I was not exiled. Nothing catastrophic happened." By the 10th call, your nervous system has enough real evidence to start recalibrating its threat prediction closer to reality. This is why the advice, "just do more calls," actually works, even though it sounds almost insultingly simple. It's not motivational fluff, it's neurologically accurate. Exposure is the mechanism through which your amygdala updates its model of what a phone call actually is. Now let's talk about something most people miss entirely when they think about fear: the difference between fear and anxiety, because they are not the same thing, and confusing them keeps people stuck. Fear is the response to a specific identifiable present threat. Like if you saw a bear right now, that's fear and it's useful. It tells you to act. Anxiety is different. Anxiety is a response to an imagined future uncertain threat. When you are sitting there before your first call, you are not experiencing fear in the technical sense. There is no bear in the room. You're experiencing anxiety, which is your mind projecting forward into a hypothetical negative outcome that hasn't happened and may never happen. Here's why that distinction matters practically. Fear tells you to act now, run, fight, freeze, because something real is happening. Anxiety, on the other hand, often paralyzes you precisely because there's nothing concrete to act on yet. You can't fight a hypothetical, you can't run from an imagined conversation. So people freeze and they call it fear. But what's actually happening is anticipatory anxiety, and anticipatory anxiety has a very specific, well documented pattern. It peaks right before the event and drops dramatically the moment the event actually begins. Think about this for a second. Has this ever happened to you? You're dreading something for hours, maybe days, and then the second it actually starts, the moment you're actually in it, you think, "Oh, this isn't so bad." That's not a coincidence. That's the well documented anxiety curve. The anticipation is almost always worse than the event. Researchers who study public speaking anxiety have found the exact same pattern. Self-reported anxiety peaks in the minutes before stepping on stage and drops within the first 30 to 60 seconds of actually speaking. Cold calling follows an almost identical curve. The worst moment of the entire call is the 3 seconds before someone picks up. Once they say hello, your nervous system already starts calming down, because now you're dealing with someone real instead of something imagined. Now here's something most people miss, and it's a little uncomfortable to hear, but I promise it's freeing once it lands. The reason the anticipation is worse than the event isn't just brain chemistry. It's also because in your imagination, you get to write the worst possible script for the other person, and you never let them speak. Think about it. When you are dreading a call, who's doing all the talking in your head? You're playing both roles. You are imagining you stammering through your pitch, and you're imagining them cold, annoyed, dismissive, maybe even cruel. But that second person, the annoyed stranger who tears you apart, you invented them. They don't exist yet. You are, in a very real sense, scaring yourself with a character you wrote. This is worth sitting with for a second, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Imagine if right now you could see all the calls you have avoided in your life on one long timeline. Every follow up you didn't make, every client you didn't reach out to, every opportunity that quietly closed itself because you never dialed that number. What would that timeline look like? For most people, it's longer than they would like to admit, not because they lacked skill or ideas or ambition, but because a character they invented in their own head, someone who was never real, kept them from ever finding out what the real person on the other end would have said. Let's bring in a piece of business history here, because this pattern, the invented villain in your head stopping you from ever finding out the truth, shows up again and again across very different industries and eras. There's a well-known story from the early days of the technology industry about a founder pitching investors for a product almost nobody understood. Yet before every single pitch meeting, by his own later accounts, he would spend the morning convinced the investors would laugh him out of the room. He would rehearse imaginary conversations where they mocked the idea. He described feeling physically sick before some of these meetings, and yet he made the calls anyway, the meetings anyway, pitch after pitch, most of which were in fact rejections, but a handful weren't. And those handful built a company that went on to change how millions of people work. The lesson from that story isn't this: his fear was irrational and yours is too, so stop worrying. That's the kind of advice that sounds nice and helps nobody, because telling someone their fear is irrational rarely makes the fear go away. Fear doesn't respond to logic, it responds to evidence. The real lesson in this: he collected the evidence by making the calls anyway. He didn't wait to feel brave. He acted while scared over and over until the accumulated evidence, dozens of real conversations instead of imagined ones, slowly retrained what his nervous system expected from the next room he walked into. So here's a practical tool you can use today, right now, on your very next call. And I want you to actually try this rather than just nodding along. It's called the evidence log, and it's ridiculously simple, which is exactly why it works. After every call, every single one, good, bad, or neutral, you write down one sentence. Just one, not a whole journal entry. One sentence describing what actually happened as plainly and factually as possible. Not "that was a disaster," which is an interpretation, but "the person said they weren't interested and hung up after 11 seconds," which is a fact. Over time, this log becomes a written record that directly contradicts the invented villain in your head, because you will notice something remarkable when you read it back after 20 or 30 seconds. Almost none of the worst case scenarios you imagine actually happened. Nobody screamed at you, nobody humiliated you in some unforgettable way. Mostly people were neutral, a little rushed, sometimes polite, occasionally interested, and every once in a while genuinely excited to hear from you. This matters because your brain doesn't naturally remember accurately under threat. It remembers selectively, and it tends to over-index on the 2 or 3 genuinely uncomfortable calls out of 100, letting those color your entire perception of what cold calling is like. The evidence log corrects for that bias by giving you cold, plain, dated facts to look back on instead of your amygdala's highlight reel of worst moments. Now let's talk about something practical you can do in the 60 seconds before you dial, because understanding the Neuroscience is one thing, but you also need something to actually do with your body and your breath in that window, because that's where the fear physically lives, not in your thoughts first, but in your body first, and your thoughts follow your body's signals more than people realize. Here's the mechanism in plain terms. When you are anxious, your breathing becomes shallow and fast, concentrated in your upper chest. This isn't just a symptom of the fear, it actively worsens it, because shallow, rapid breathing signals to your nervous system that a threat is actively present, which then produces more of the anxiety chemicals, which then makes your breathing even shallower. It's a feedback loop and it can spin up in a matter of seconds. The good news is the loop runs both directions. If you deliberately slow and deepen your breathing before a call, you send the opposite signal to your nervous system, a signal of safety, and the anxiety response actually starts to physically decrease. Not eventually, but within about 90 seconds. The specific technique that's been studied most and shown to work fastest is called physiological sighing, and it's used by researchers who study stress recovery in real time. Here's exactly how to do it, and I want you to actually try this the next time you feel that pre-call tightness in your chest. Take one normal breath in through your nose, then without exhaling, take a second shorter breath in on top of it, so your lungs are as full as they can get. Then release it all in one long slow exhale through your mouth, longer than the inhale, like you are gently blowing out a candle from a few feet away. Do that twice, just twice, that's it. Two of those breaths physically lower your heart rate and shift your nervous system out of the fight or flight pattern and toward something calmer, more grounded, more capable of actually thinking clearly instead of freezing. Why does this work so fast compared to other calming techniques? Because of a structure in your brainstem that directly monitors your breathing pattern and uses it as one of its primary signals for whether you are in danger. Long exhales specifically activate what's called the parasympathetic nervous system. Think of it as your body's built-in stand-down signal, the opposite of the alarm bell. You don't have to believe in this for it to work. You don't have to meditate for 20 years to become a different kind of person. You just have to do the physical mechanics of the breath, and your nervous system responds whether you believe in it or not. The same way your stomach digests food whether you believe in digestion or not. Before we move on, I want to give you one more piece of the puzzle, because breathing calms the body, but you also need something for the mind, and this is where most fear reduction advice completely falls apart, because it tells people to just think positive or visualize success, which frankly doesn't work very well for most people and can even backfire, because forcing yourself to believe something your brain doesn't yet have evidence for often makes the anxiety worse, not better. It's like trying to convince yourself you're not scared of a bear by insisting really hard that bears are friendly. Your brain doesn't buy it, and now you are anxious and also frustrated that the positive thinking isn't working. Here's what actually works instead, and it comes from research on how elite performers, athletes, surgeons, public speakers manage pre-performance anxiety. It's called reappraisal, and it's subtly but importantly different from positive thinking. Instead of trying to convince yourself you're calm, you relabel the physical sensation itself. Right before a call, if your heart is racing and your palms are sweaty, instead of thinking I'm anxious, this is bad, you say to yourself out loud, if you can, I'm excited, my body is getting ready to perform. This sounds almost too simple to matter, but researchers who have studied this, including work on public speaking and math test performance found that people who relabeled their physiological arousal as excitement rather than anxiety performed measurably better than those who tried to calm down or those who did nothing at all. Here's why this works, and it's genuinely fascinating. Once you understand the mechanism, excitement and anxiety are physiologically almost the same state in your body. Elevated heart rate, increased adrenaline, heightened alertness. Your body cannot easily tell the difference between the physical sensations of I am afraid and I am pumped up and ready. The difference is almost entirely in the label your mind attaches to those sensations, and because trying to move from anxious to calm requires your body to completely change its physiological state, which takes time and effort. But moving from anxious to excited requires almost no physiological change at all, just a different label on sensations that are already there. Reappraisal is a much easier, much faster shift to make in the moment right before you dial. So here's something most people miss entirely, and I want you to actually remember this specific line. Your shaking hands are not proof that you're not ready. They are proof that your body is fully mobilized and ready to perform. The sensation you're calling fear and sensation an Olympic sprinter calls in the zone right before the gun goes off are almost chemically identical. The only difference is the story you tell yourself about what that feeling means. Now let's talk about why so many people fail at this. Not in a harsh way but in an honest way. Because I think understanding failure patterns clearly is more useful than another round of generic encouragement. The first and the most common failure pattern is what I'll call the readiness trap. This is the belief that you need to feel ready before you make the call. You just tell yourself, I'll call once I have practiced the script a few more times, or I'll call once I know the product better, or I'll call first thing tomorrow when I'm fresher. On the surface, this sounds responsible. It sounds like diligence, but notice what's actually happening. Underneath it, you're making the call conditional on an internal feeling, and feelings of readiness, as we have already discussed, don't arrive on command. They arrive after action, not before it. So the readiness trap isn't really about preparation at all. It's fear wearing the costume of responsibility. The second failure pattern is what researchers who study procrastination call emotional avoidance, and it's more insidious because it doesn't feel like avoidance while you're doing it. This is when you fill your morning with tasks that feel productive, organizing your contact list, updating your notes, researching the company one more time, tweaking your script for the fifth time, none of which are bad things to do, but all of which conveniently push the actual call further and further down the day. By 4 in the afternoon, you tell yourself there's no point calling now, better to start fresh tomorrow, and tomorrow the same pattern repeats. This is one of the most common and most invisible ways fear defeats people, because it never looks like fear from the outside. It looks like busyness, it looks like thoroughness, but the underlying function is identical to sitting in the car for an hour. It's avoidance just dressed up in a productivity costume. The third pattern, and this one is particularly cruel because it punishes people for trying, is what I would call the single data point trap. This is when someone makes one call, gets a hard no, maybe even a rude one, and immediately concludes I am bad at this, or this doesn't work, or people don't want to hear from me. One data point treated as if it were the entire data set. Here's the problem with that logic. laid out plainly. If you flipped a coin once and it landed on heads, would you conclude the coin always lands on heads? Of course not. You would recognize you need more flips before you can say anything meaningful about the pattern. But somehow, with cold calls, people give themselves permission to draw sweeping conclusions from a sample size of one, and because that conclusion feels true in the moment, because the rejection is fresh and painful, people stop right there at exactly the point where the data is least reliable and the sample size is far too small to mean anything. Let me give you a number here that tends to reframe this instantly for people. In most cold outreach contexts across industries, response and conversion rates on individual calls are genuinely low, often somewhere in the range of a handful of successful outcomes per 100 attempts, depending heavily on the industry, the offer, and the list quality. Read that again. A handful out of 100. That means the overwhelming statistical default outcome of any single call is some form of no, not interested, or no answer at all. This isn't a flaw in you. This is simply the base rate of the activity. The same way a baseball player who gets a hit 3 times out of 10 at bats is considered an outstanding hitter, not a failure. Two-thirds of the time, if you go into a call believing that a no means something is wrong with you, you have misunderstood the entire mathematical nature of the activity you are engaged in. A no isn't evidence you are bad at this. A no is simply the statistically expected, overwhelmingly common outcome of the format itself. Now, here's something that will change how you think about this permanently if you let it. Once you understand this base rate, the fear response starts to feel almost absurd. Not because the fear is stupid, but because you can see the mismatch clearly. You're not afraid of losing something you actually have. You are afraid of the most common statistically default outcome of a numbers game. Imagine being terrified every time you flipped a coin and it might land on tails. That's essentially the emotional posture a lot of people bring into their first calls, treating an expected, common, mathematically ordinary outcome as if it were a personal catastrophe. Let's bring in another story here because I think a customer facing example makes this land differently than a sales specific one. There's a well documented case in the history of a major hospitality company where a young front desk employee new to the job, only a few weeks in, was terrified of having to call guests back about billing disputes, a task that involved delivering unhappy news to people who were often already frustrated. She avoided the task for as long as she could, letting a manager handle her assigned calls twice before her supervisor finally sat her down, not to reprimand her but to ask her directly what she was afraid would happen. Her answer, by her own later account in an internal training video used for new hires, was simple. She was afraid the guest would yell at her and she wouldn't know what to say back. Her supervisor gave her one instruction that ended up defining the rest of her career in hospitality management: let them yell. You don't have to fix the yelling. You just have to listen until it stops and then solve the actual problem. She made the call, the guest did, in fact, raise his voice for about the first 30 seconds, and then once he had said his piece, he calmed down completely because, and this is the part people forget, most anger on the other end of the call isn't really about you personally. It's about a frustration that existed before you ever dialed, and once it's voiced, it naturally deflates. She solved the billing issue in under 5 minutes. That employee went on to run guest relations for an entire hotel group years later, and she still tells new hires the exact same line her supervisor told her: let them yell, you don't have to fix the yelling, you just have to listen until it stops. The lesson embedded in that story applies directly to your fear of that first call, whatever kind of call it is. The worst case scenario you're imagining, someone yelling, someone being harsh, someone hanging up abruptly. Even in the rare cases where it happens, it is almost never as catastrophic in reality as it is in your imagination, and it is almost always shorter lived than you expect. Anger, frustration, rejection, these are weather, not climate. They pass through. They are not a permanent verdict on you as a person or a professional. Here's something worth asking yourself, and I want you to actually sit with this question rather than rushing past it. What would you attempt this month if you knew with complete certainty that no single rejection could actually hurt you? Not if you weren't afraid, that's a fantasy because you will be afraid. That's established at this point. But what if you knew factually, the way you know gravity exists, that a stranger's no carries zero actual power to damage you? I would guess your list of calls, messages, and pitches you would be willing to make would grow substantially. And here's the thing, that fact is already true. It is true this whole time. It was true this whole time. A stranger's no on a call who has exactly as much power over your actual life, your actual safety, your actual worth as a professional as the weather in a city you have never visited. It might be unpleasant to imagine, but it does not reach you, does not touch you, does not change anything about your actual capability or your actual future unless you decide to let it. Now let's get practical, because understanding all of this intellectually is one thing, but you need an actual framework for the specific 10 seconds after someone picks up the phone, because that's where most beginners completely blank out, script or no script. Here's what's happening neurologically in that moment, and once you understand it, the solution becomes obvious. When someone answers and says hello, your brain, if it's still running on high alert, floods you with a burst of processing demand. It's trying to simultaneously listen to their tone, predict their reaction, retrieve your script from memory, monitor your own voice for signs of nervousness, and plan several sentences ahead, all within about 1 second. This is far more cognitive load than your working memory can actually handle at once. And the result for almost everyone is a brief freeze, that awkward half-second stumble at the very start of a cold call that beginners dread so much. The fix isn't memorize your script better, although that helps a little. The real fix is to drastically reduce the cognitive load required in that first moment. And the way you do that is by making your opening line so simple, so automatic, so free of decision points that it requires almost no working memory at all to deliver. Think of it like a running start. You don't need your legs at full sprint speed the instant the gun goes off. You just need enough momentum to get moving, and the rest builds from there. Here's a framework that works well for almost any first call, whatever industry you are in. Name, reason, permission. First, say your name and where you're calling from, quickly and plainly, no over explaining. Second, give one clear short reason for the call, not your whole pitch, just the headline of why you're reaching out. Third, and this is the part almost nobody does but which works remarkably well, ask for permission to continue. Something as simple as, do you have 60 seconds, or is now an okay time? This single move does something powerful psychologically. It hands a small piece of control back to the person on the other end, which immediately lowers their defensiveness, because people resist being pitched at, but they rarely resist being asked a simple, respectful question. Why does asking for permission work so well? There's a well documented principle in psychology called reactance, which describes how people instinctively push back against anything that feels like it's being forced on them, even if the thing itself is genuinely valuable to them. A cold call that barrels straight into a pitch without any acknowledgement of the other person's time or autonomy triggers reactance almost immediately. The listener's guard goes up before you have even said anything of substance, purely because of the format. But a call that opens up by asking plainly and briefly whether now is an okay time sidesteps reactance almost entirely, because you have treated the person as someone with a choice rather than a target. Let's talk about tonality for a moment, because this is something beginners chronically get wrong, not out of incompetence but because nobody explains the actual mechanism to them. When people are nervous, their voice tends to do one of two things. It either speeds up dramatically, cramming words together in a rush to just get through the opening, or it rises in pitch, especially at the ends of sentences, which consciously signals uncertainty to the listener, even if the words themselves are confident. Here's the tricky part. You cannot simply tell yourself sound more confident in the moment and expect your voice to comply, because your voice is controlled largely by automatic processes, not conscious decisions, especially under stress. What actually works is a physical trick rather than a mental one, and this comes from voice coaches who train broadcasters and public speakers. Before you dial and even during the call, if you can manage it, deliberately drop your speaking pace by roughly 20% slower than what feels natural in the moment, and let your pitch fall rather than rise at the end of your sentences, especially your very first sentence. This feels almost uncomfortably slow when you're anxious, because anxiety wants you to rush through the discomfort as fast as possible. But slower pacing and falling pitch are two of the strongest vocal signals of calm authority that exist. And remarkably, if you do these two things physically, your actual internal state often follows along behind them within a few sentences. This is sometimes called the facial feedback principle applied to voice. Your physiology can lead your emotional state just as often as your emotional state leads your physiology. Now, have you ever wondered why some people seem to bounce back from a hard no almost instantly, cheerfully dialing the very next number within seconds, while others get derailed for the rest of the day after just one rough call? This isn't some innate personality trait that some people are born with and others aren't. It's a skill, and it's built on a specific mental habit called attributional style, a concept from psychological research on resilience and depression that turns out to apply directly to cold calling stamina. Here's the mechanism. When something goes badly, say someone hangs up on you abruptly, your mind automatically generates an explanation for why it happened, usually within a fraction of a second, often without you even noticing you are doing it. People who recover quickly tend to generate explanations that are specific, temporary, and external. Something like, that person seemed rushed, maybe I caught them at a bad moment. People who spiral into a bad mood for the rest of the day tend to generate explanations that are global, permanent, and internal. Something like, I am bad at this, or nobody wants what I am offering, or I am just not cut out for this kind of work. Same event, wildly different emotional aftermath, driven entirely by which explanation the mind reaches for first. Here's something most people miss about this. You actually have more control over which explanation you reach for than it feels like in the moment, because this process, while automatic, is also trainable. The same way you can train yourself to reach for a healthier food option once you have built the habit deliberately enough times. The trick is to catch the global permanent internal explanation the instant it appears and consciously, deliberately replace it with a specific temporary external one, even if you're not 100% sure it's true. You're not lying to yourself, you're choosing the most statistically reasonable interpretation, because remember, a single hang up is a single data point, and reaching for "I'm bad at this" from one data point is exactly the single data point trap we already discussed. The specific temporary external explanation isn't just kinder to yourself, it's also more accurate because it doesn't overgeneralize from insufficient evidence. Let's do a mini recap before we keep moving, because we have covered a lot of ground and I want the key pieces to lock in clearly before we build further. Your fear of the first call comes from an ancient threat detection system that can't tell the difference between social rejection and physical danger. That system updates itself through real experience, not through willpower or positive thinking, which is why making the call matters more than feeling ready to make it. The anticipation of the call is almost always worse than the call itself, because anxiety peaks before an event and drops once the event actually begins. Physiological sighing, 2 breaths, long exhale can calm your nervous system within about 90 seconds. Labeling your physical arousal as excitement rather than anxiety measurably improves performance, because the two states are nearly identical in the body and differ mainly in the label your mind assigns them. And finally, a single rejection is not meaningful data. It's simply the statistically expected default outcome of a numbers game, and how to explain that rejection to yourself afterward determines whether you bounce back in seconds or spiral for the rest of the day. But here's the interesting part, and this is where we are headed next. Understanding fear and calming your body is only half the equation. The other half is what you actually do with your hands and your calendar in the hours and days around your first call. Because willpower alone is a famously unreliable resource, and relying on raw willpower to overcome fear day after day is a strategy that works for almost nobody consistently. There's a better way, built on structure rather than motivation, and that's exactly where we are going next. Willpower, according to a large body of research, is behavioral psychology. Behaves less like a fixed character trait and more like a battery that drains throughout the day with every decision you make, every temptation you resist, every uncomfortable task you push yourself through. This is sometimes called decision fatigue, and it's why the version of you at 9 in the morning, fresh and rested, is often far more capable of picking up the phone than the version of you at 4 in the afternoon, after a full day of small decisions have already worn down your reserves. This is exactly why so many people schedule their hardest part for later today, and then discover at 4:30 that they suddenly have zero capacity left to push through the discomfort. It's not that they got lazier as the day went on, their willpower battery genuinely ran lower, and the task that required the most of it kept getting deferred to the moment they had the least of it available. The solution isn't to try harder or to shame yourself into more discipline. The solution is to redesign your environment and your schedule so that making the call requires a little willpower as possible, because the less willpower a task requires, the less it matters how depleted your battery is when you get to it. This is sometimes called environmental design, and it's one of the most underrated tools in overcoming any kind of avoidance behavior, not just cold call fear. Here's a concrete example of what that looks like in practice. Instead of leaving your first call as a vague item somewhere on a to-do list, make calls today. You specify the exact time down to the minute, and you specify it for the earliest reasonable point in your day, ideally before you have made very many other decisions yet. You write down the exact name and number you are calling, not call some leads which requires you to make yet another decision in the moment, but a specific name, a specific number already pulled up, already visible, so that the only decision left is that instant. In that instant is to press one button. This might sound almost too simple to matter, but research on habit formation and task initiation consistently shows that the number of small decisions standing between you and starting a task is one of the strongest predictors of whether you will actually start it, for more than how motivated you feel. There's a related concept worth understanding here called the 2-minute rule, which was popularized in productivity circles but has deep roots in behavioral psychology. The idea is that any task, no matter how large or intimidating it feels, as a whole can be broken down into a version of itself that takes less than 2 minutes to begin. You are not trying to talk yourself into having an entire successful conversation. You are trying to talk yourself into doing exactly one small physical action, picking up the phone and dialing the first 3 digits. That's it. That's the entire commitment you are making to yourself in that moment. Once you have dialed, the call is already happening. And remember what we established earlier: anxiety peaks before the event and drops sharply once it begins. So the 2-minute version of make the call isn't have a great conversation, it's simply dial. Everything else follows from there almost automatically, because you are no longer negotiating with your own fear in the abstract. You are just following through on a physical motion you already started. Let's bring in a story here that illustrates this idea beautifully from a completely different field, because I think it lands harder when it's not directly about sales. There's a well documented account of a concert violinist early in her career who suffered from crippling stage fright, so severe that she once vomited before a recital in her early 20s. By her own later account in interviews, she considered quitting performance entirely and moving into teaching instead, believing she simply didn't have the temperament for live performance. What changed things for her wasn't some sudden burst of courage. It was a specific structural trick her mentor gave her. Instead of thinking about the entire concert as one enormous, terrifying event, she was told to think only about the first 4 notes, just the first 4 notes, played correctly. Nothing else, not the recital, not the audience, not the reviews, 4 notes. She later described that once she got through the first 4 notes, something shifted every single time. The terror of the whole performance dissolved into simply continuing what she had already begun, note by note, phrase by phrase. The same woman who once considered quitting went on to have a decades long performing career. The lesson generalizes remarkably well beyond music. Your brain is far more capable of committing to 4 notes or one dial or one sentence than it is to committing to an entire terrifying event held in its full overwhelming totality. Big, vague, whole tasks trigger avoidance. Small, specific physical first actions rarely do. This leads directly to something worth asking yourself right now, and I mean actually asking, not rhetorically skimming past it. What is the smallest possible physical action that starts your version of the first call? Is it opening your contact list? Is it picking up the receiver? Is it typing the first 3 digits of the number? Whatever that smallest unit is for you, that's the only thing you need to commit to, not the whole conversation, not the outcome, just the first physical motion. There's another piece of environmental design worth mentioning here, and it comes from research on what's called implementation intentions, a fairly dry academic term for something remarkably powerful and simple. An implementation intention is a specific if then plan you set in advance before the moment of temptation or fear arrives, so that your brain doesn't have to make a fresh decision under pressure. Something like, if it's 9:15 and I haven't dialed yet, then I will physically stand up, take two breaths and dial regardless of how I feel. Studies on implementation intentions across many different behaviors, exercise, healthy eating, difficult conversations, consistently find that people who set these specific if then plans in advance follow through at dramatically higher rates than people who simply intend to do the thing without a specific trigger attached to it. Why does this work so well? Because in the moment of fear, your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for rational decision making and long-term thinking, is partially hijacked by the more primitive threat response system we talked about earlier. Trying to reason your way through a decision in that hijack state is much harder than simply executing a decision you already made earlier, back when your prefrontal cortex was fully online and calm. An implementation intention essentially outsources the decision to your past self, the version of you that wasn't currently flooded with anxiety, so that your present anxious self doesn't have to fight that battle from scratch. Here's something most people miss out about combining all of this together. None of these tools, the breathing technique, the reappraisal of arousal as excitement, the evidence log, the 2-minute rule, the implementation intentions, are meant to eliminate the fear entirely. I want to be honest with you about that, because a lot of content out there oversells the idea that with the right trick, the fear disappears completely and you become a fearless calling machine. That's not realistic, and frankly, it's not even desirable. A small amount of activation of nervous energy keeps you sharp, keeps you attentive to the other person, keeps you from becoming complacent or careless. What these tools actually do is lower the fear from a paralyzing 10 out of 10 down to manageable 3 or 4 out of 10, a level where you can still feel it humming in the background, but it no longer stops you from acting. That's the actual realistic goal here, and it's worth naming clearly, because chasing complete fearlessness as your goal often backfires, leaving you feeling like a failure every time you notice even a small trace of nervousness remaining. Now let's talk about a specific flavor of this fear that deserves its own attention, because it shows up constantly in people making their first calls, especially people who are new to a role, an industry or a skill entirely. It's called imposter syndrome, and it's the nagging sense that you don't actually belong in the room, that you are somehow fooling everyone into thinking you are more capable than you really are, and that at any moment someone is going to see through you and expose you as unqualified. Here's what's important to understand about imposter syndrome in the specific context of a first call. It almost always gets louder right before you attempt something you haven't done many times yet, precisely because your brain has so little real evidence of your own competence in this specific new domain. If you have made 1,000 calls in your life, in some other context, your imposter syndrome about calling in general is probably fairly low. But your first call in a brand new role, a brand new industry, or a brand new skill has almost no accumulated evidence behind it yet. And imposter syndrome thrives in exactly that evidence vacuum. This is actually good news once you see it clearly, because it means imposter syndrome isn't a permanent verdict about who you are. It's a temporary condition caused by low reps in a specific new domain, and it fades reliably as those reps accumulate, the same way cold call anxiety itself fades with real experience. There's a subtle but important distinction worth making here between confidence and competence, because people frequently confuse the order in which these two things arrive. Most people assume competence has to come first, that you need to become good at something before you are allowed to feel confident doing it. But in a reality, for almost any skill involving other people, some baseline confidence, or at least the outer behavior of confidence, often has to come first or close to first, because your very first attempts are by definition going to happen before you are skilled. And if you wait for skill to arrive before you are willing to act, you will never generate the reps that build the skill in the first place. This is something sometimes summarized as you have to be willing to be bad at something before you can become good at it. And cold calling is a particularly unforgiving example of this principle, because there is no way to skip the early awkward imperfect reps and go straight to the smooth confident version of yourself. There's a subtle but important distinction worth making here between confidence and competence, because people frequently confuse the order in which these two things arrive. Most people assume competence has to come first, that you need to become good at something before you are allowed to feel confident doing it. But in reality, for almost any skill involving other people, some baseline confidence, or at least the outward behavior of confidence, often has to come first or close to first, because your very first attempts are by definition going to happen before you are skilled. And if you wait for skill to arrive before you are willing to act, you will never generate the reps that build the skill in the first place. This is sometimes summarized as you have to be willing to be bad at something before you can become good at it. And cold calling is a particularly unforgiving example of this principle, because there is no way to skip the early awkward imperfect reps and go straight to the smooth confident version of yourself. Let's bring a busy story here that I think captures this particularly well, because it involves not just fear of a single call, but fear sustained across an enormous volume of rejection, which is really what a career built on calling looks like over time. Not just the first call, but the thousandth. There's a widely told story from the startup world about a founder in early 2010 who, while trying to raise funding for his company, was rejected by over 100 investors before finding the one who said yes. 100 rejections, not one, not five, over 100. Each one a version of the exact fear we have been discussing all along. The dread before the call, the anticipation, the hand on the phone. What's notable about how he later described this period isn't that the rejection stopped hurting. He was candid in interviews that some of them stung quite a bit, particularly ones where investors were dismissive or condescending about the idea. What changed over that 100 plus rejection stress wasn't his emotional sensitivity to rejection, it was his relationship to what a single rejection meant about his prospects overall. Somewhere around rejection 30 or 40 by his account, he stopped treating each individual no as a referendum on the entire company's future and started treating it simply as one data point in an ongoing search process. Exactly the kind of reframe we discussed earlier with the coin flip analogy. The company he eventually built after that one investor said yes went on to reach a valuation in the billions. I want to be careful here, because I don't want you to hear that story and think the lesson is if you just push through enough rejections you are guaranteed a $1 billion outcome. That's not the lesson, and it wouldn't be honest to suggest it. Most people who push through 100 rejections don't end up with a $1 billion company. The actual lesson is narrower and more universally true. The rejections themselves did not stop him from continuing, and continuing was the only path by which the eventual yes became possible at all. If he had stopped at rejection number 40, convinced by that point that the pattern was permanent and unchangeable, he never would have reached the conversation that changed everything. You cannot know in advance which call is the one that works out. You only know that none of them can work out if you never make them. This brings us to a reframe about the word no itself that I think is worth spending real time on, because most people, especially beginners, treat no as a verdict, a final personal judgment about their worth, their pitch, their competence, even their character. But if you look at what no actually represents, is almost every real conversation. It's rarely any of those things. It's usually a reflection of timing, budget, mood, prior experience with something unrelated, or simply a mismatch between what you are offering and what that specific person needs at this specific moment. None of those things are about you as a person. They are contextual facts about someone else's situation, facts you often have no visibility into and no control over. Here's a useful mental model for this, borrowed loosely from how researchers and clinicians describe cognitive distortions in general, thinking patterns that feel true in the moment but don't hold up under scrutiny. One common distortion is called personalization, which is the tendency to interpret neutral or external events as being specifically about you, when in reality they usually aren't. A no on a cold call is, statistically speaking, almost never actually about you. It's about 100 variables in the other person's life that existed long before your call and will continue long after it, most of which have nothing to do with your product, your pitch, or your worth as a professional. Recognizing personalization when it happens, catching yourself mid-spiral and asking, wait, is this actually about me, or am I just assuming it is one of the fastest ways to strip a no of its emotional weight. There's a reframe here that some of the best performing salespeople and founders use deliberately, almost as a kind of internal scoreboard, and it's worth adopting for yourself. Instead of counting yeses as your only measure of success on a given day, they count attempts. The goal for the day isn't get 3 yeses, the goal is make 20 calls. Why does this distinction matter so much? Because yeses are only partially within your control. They depend on the other person, on market conditions, on timing, on a dozen variables outside your influence. But attempts are entirely within your control. Yes, decide whether you dial the phone. Nobody else decides that for you. When your daily measure of success is something entirely within your control, the fear of rejection loses a huge amount of its power over your sense of accomplishment, because a no longer represents a failed day. It represents one successful attempt, logged, counted, and done, regardless of what the other person said back. Now let's talk about something that happens even after you have made the call, even after you have gotten past the opening line, even after your breathing is under control, the mid-call freeze. This is that moment where you are actually in the conversation, things seem to be going fine, and then suddenly, without warning, your mind goes completely blank. You forget what you were going to say next. There's a silence that feels like it stretches for an entire eternity, but is probably only 2 or 3 seconds. Your heart rate spikes again, seemingly out of nowhere, and you scramble to recover. Here's what actually here's what's actually happening in that moment, and understanding the mechanism takes a lot of the panic out of it. The mid-call freeze usually happens when something unexpected occurs. The other person says something you didn't anticipate, asks a question your script doesn't cover, or responds in a tone that doesn't match what you rehearsed in your head. Your brain, which had been running on a comfortable preloaded script, suddenly has to switch from recite what I memorized to generate a new response in real time. And that switch takes a small but very real cognitive toll, especially under the residual stress that's already present from the call itself. The good news is that silence in this specific context is far less damaging than beginners believe it to be. Here's something that almost nobody tells new callers, and it changes how you experience the freeze once you know it. 2 or 3 seconds of silence on a phone call feels like an eternity to you because you are hyper aware of it, monitoring it in real time, dreading it. But to the person on the other end who isn't monitoring your internal state at all, a brief pause often reads as simply thoughtful or as you gathering words, not as a red flag or a sign of incompetence. Silence is asymmetric. It's far louder inside your own head than it is in the actual conversation. Here's a practical tool for the mid-call freeze that professional broadcasters and interviewers use constantly, precisely because dead air is one of their biggest occupational fears, and it translates directly to cold calling. It's called the bridging phrase, and it's a short, low content, natural sounding phrase that buys you a second or two of thinking time without creating an awkward silence. Phrases like, "That's a great question, let me think about the best way to explain that," "oh," or "yeah, that's actually something I get asked a lot," or simply "good point." These phrases aren't filler in the sense of being meaningless. They serve a real function. They keep the conversational rhythm alive while your brain catches up and formulates an actual answer. Professional interviewers often use bridging phrases constantly, and listeners rarely notice them as anything other than natural conversational flow, because that's exactly what they are. Let's bring in another story here because I think it's important to see this pattern show up in a completely different context than sales or business to reinforce just how universal this fear really is. There's a well documented account of a former US president who, before entering politics, described himself as someone who dreaded public speaking to the point of physical illness in his younger years. Someone who would rehearse remarks obsessively and still feel his hands shake before stepping up to a podium, even well into his political career. This is a pattern that shows up again and again in biographies of people who are now remembered specifically for their communication skills. Many of them describe a period, sometimes a long period, where the fear of speaking, of being heard, of being judged in real time by an audience felt almost unbearable. What changed in nearly every one of these accounts wasn't some sudden internal transformation where the fear vanished. It was volume, repetition, hundreds, sometimes thousands of speeches, remarks, and conversations, each one adding another data point to the same prediction engine we discussed earlier in the neuroscience section. The fear didn't disappear, it became familiar. And familiar fear, it turns out, is a completely different experience to live with than novel fear, even though the physical sensations are nearly identical. Novel fear feels catastrophic because your brain has no template for what's about to happen. Familiar fear, even when it's still uncomfortable, comes with an implicit sense of, "I have felt this before and I got through it before," which changes its entire emotional texture, even without becoming smaller in raw intensity. This brings us to something worth addressing directly, because I have been dancing around it throughout this whole discussion, and I think it deserves to be named plainly. The voice in your head during and after a hard call, the one that says things like, "You sounded ridiculous." They could tell you were nervous, You are not cut out for this. That voice has a name in psychological literature. It's called the inner critic, and understanding its actual function changes your relationship to it dramatically. Here's the counterintuitive thing about the inner critic that almost nobody explains clearly. It didn't develop to make you miserable, it developed originally as a protective mechanism, a way of anticipating criticism from others before it happens, so that you are never caught off guard, never blindsided by judgment. In a strange backwards way, the inner critic is trying to protect you by criticizing you first, on the theory that if you already know your own flaws, external criticism can't hurt as much. The problem is that this protective mechanism, which might have been mildly useful in small doses, tends to run wildly overactive in situations that trigger social threat like cold calling, and instead of protecting you, it becomes the loudest source of the very fear you're trying to overcome. Here's a practical technique for dealing with the inner critic that's used in various forms across cognitive behavioral approaches, and it's called externalization. Instead of treating the critical voice as simply you, as an accurate reflection of reality, you deliberately give it some distance by naming it, almost like a separate character. Some people literally give it a name. Something slightly silly works well because silliness undercuts the authority the voice tries to claim. When the voice says you sounded ridiculous just now, instead of accepting that as fact, you notice, that's the inner critic again doing its thing. This tiny shift from being fused with the thought of observing the thought as a separate mental event creates just enough psychological distance that the thought loses some of its grip. You're not arguing with it, you're not trying to silence it entirely, which rarely works anyway. You are simply recognizing it as a familiar pattern rather than an objective verdict on your performance. Here's something most people miss about the inner critic that's worth sitting with. The volume and harshness of your inner critic after a call almost never correlates with how the call actually went as judged by any objective outside observer. If you recorded your calls, and many training programs do exactly this for review purposes, you would frequently find that the calls you were most convinced were terribly the ones your inner critic tore apart to afterward sound completely unremarkable on playback, sometimes even genuinely fine, professional, competent. The inner critic isn't a reliable narrator of what happened. It's a reliable narrator of your internal anxiety level, which is a completely different thing. This actually leads to one of the most powerful, if slightly uncomfortable, tools available to anyone trying to overcome call anxiety, and that's recording and reviewing your own calls. I know the instinct here. The idea of listening back to yourself sounds mortifying to a lot of people, maybe even more frightening than the call itself. But here's why it works so well, despite the discomfort, and why so many professional training programs in sales, customer service, and even therapy build in mandatory call review as a core part of skill development. When you review a recording of your own call, you're doing something your anxious mind almost never lets you do in the moment. You are gathering objective external evidence about what actually happened rather than relying on your inner critic's highly distorted, anxiety colored memory of events. Almost universally, people who review their own calls for the first time report the same surprising discovery. It wasn't nearly as bad as they remembered it being. The pauses they thought were excruciating were barely noticeable. The stumble they were sure the other person caught onto was minor and quickly recovered from. This is powerful evidence-based correction of the distorted narrative your inner critic constructs, and it works precisely because it's not you telling yourself it wasn't that bad. It's you hearing with your own ears that it wasn't that bad. There's a specific way to do this review that maximizes the benefit without turning it into another self-criticism session, because it's entirely possible to review your own calls in a way that just feeds the inner critic more ammunition, which defeats the purpose. The method that works best used in many structured coaching programs is to listen once purely for what went well, genuinely, deliberately looking for three specific things you did competently. Even small things like asking a good question or recovering smoothly from a pause. Only after that first pass do you listen a second time for one specific concrete thing to improve, not a vague global judgment like I sounded nervous, but something specific and actionable like I could pause slightly longer after asking my question instead of immediately filling the silence. This ordering matters enormously. Starting with what went well primes your brain to notice competence rather than defaulting immediately to your inner critic's favorite pattern of global harsh judgment. Let's bring in a case study here from customer service, because handling an actual objection or pushback live on a call is one of the moments beginners fear most, even more than the initial rejection, because it requires thinking on your feet in real time while someone is actively pushing back against you. There's a well documented training case used by a major telecommunications company involving a customer service representative early in her career who struggled specifically with customers who challenged her directly, questioning her competence, asking to speak to a supervisor, or expressing open frustration with the company before she would even had before she had even had a chance she would have even had a chance to help them. Her training supervisor gave her a reframe that ended up being foundational to her entire approach going forward, and it's a reframe worth adopting for any kind of first call where pushback is possible. He told her that an objection is not an attack. An objection is information. When a customer says this is ridiculous, I have called 3 times already, that's not a judgment of her personally. It's a data point telling her exactly what the customer needs most right now, which in that case was acknowledgement that their time had already been wasted before any actual problem solving could even begin. Once she started hearing objections as information rather than attacks, her whole physiological relationship to pushback changed. She wasn't bracing for a blow anymore. She was listening for data. This reframe generalizes remarkably well to cold calling of any kind. When someone says, I'm not interested, that's not a verdict on your worth. It's information, maybe information that your timing is off, maybe information that your opening didn't clearly convey relevance to their specific situation, maybe simply information that this particular person at this particular moment has other priorities. None of those are personal attacks. They are data points you can use or simply release depending on whether they are useful to you. Now let's talk about something important that I don't want to gloss over, because it would be irresponsible to suggest that all discomfort is created equal, or that you should simply push through any and all forms of stress in pursuit of growth. There's an important distinction here between what's sometimes called productive discomfort and harmful chronic stress, and understanding where that line sits matters for your long-term well-being, not just your short-term performance on a single call. Productive discomfort is the kind we have been discussing throughout most of this conversation. The racing heart before a call, the sweaty palms, the anticipatory dread that fades once you are actually in motion. This kind of discomfort, while unpleasant, is time limited, tied to a specific identifiable event and followed by genuine recovery once the event passes. It's the kind of stress that, handled well, actually builds resilience over time, the same way lifting a weight that's slightly too heavy builds muscle, precisely because the discomfort is temporary and followed by rest. Harmful chronic stress looks different, and it's worth knowing the difference so you can recognize it in yourself if it starts to show up. This is the kind of stress that doesn't resolve after the event passes, where the dread of the next call or the next day of calls follows you into your evenings, disrupts your sleep consistently, shows up as persistent physical tension that doesn't ease even hours after your last call ended, or bleeds into other areas of your life that have nothing to do with calling at all. If what you are experiencing looks more like this second pattern, sustained, unrelenting, not resolving with rest, affecting your sleep or your relationships or your overall functioning, that's worth taking seriously and worth talking to a doctor or mental health professional about, because that pattern goes beyond ordinary performance anxiety and deserves real support, not just tactical breathing exercises. I want to be clear about this distinction, because the goal of everything we are discussing in these 3 hours is to help you move through normal, expected, temporary performance anxiety, not to encourage you to grit your teeth through something that's actually become unmanageable or unhealthy. If the fear of calling has become the kind of thing that's affecting your sleep most nights, or making you dread entire days, or spilling into panic that doesn't resolve, that's a signal to get support, not just another mental trick to push through it alone. Let's shift now to something practical and social, because so far we have focused heavily on what's happening inside your own head and body, but there's a whole other dimension to overcoming this fear that involves other people, and it's a dimension beginners frequently overlook, entirely assuming this is a battle they have to fight completely alone. Here's a concept from behavioral science called social accountability, and it's one of the most reliably effective tools across almost every domain where people struggle with avoidance, exercise, dieting, quitting, smoking, and yes, cold calling. The basic mechanism is simple. When you know someone else is going to ask you specifically and directly whether you made your calls today, the psychological cost of avoiding the task goes up substantially, because now the avoidance isn't just an private disappointment you can quietly rationalize away. It's something you will have to explain to another person. This added social weight, uncomfortable as it might sound, tends to tip the scales in favor of action for a surprising number of people who otherwise struggle with pure self-discipline. This doesn't require some elaborate formal system. It can be as simple as a colleague, a friend, or a mentor who agrees to check in with you at the end of each day with one question: did you make your calls? Some sales teams build this into their culture deliberately, with morning huddles where each person states their call target for the day out loud in front of the group, and afternoon check-ins where they report back. The mechanism isn't about shame or punishment. It's about the simple fact that humans across an enormous range of behaviors are more consistent when their actions are witnessed by someone else, even in a low-stakes supportive way. There's a related tool worth mentioning here called temptation bundling, which pairs something you are avoiding with something you enjoy, so the overall experience of doing the hard thing becomes less purely unpleasant. For calling specifically, this might look like only allowing yourself your favorite coffee or your favorite podcast between calls, or a small specific reward immediately after completing your call block for the day. This isn't about bribing yourself in some manipulative way. It's about recognizing that your brain responds to genuine incentive structures and building small, immediate rewards around a task that otherwise only offers delayed, uncertain rewards. Like a sale that might close weeks later, helps bridge the motivational gap in the meantime. Let's bring in a story from sports psychology here, because elite athletic performance under pressure has been studied more rigorously than almost any other domain of human performance, and the parallels to cold call anxiety are strikingly direct. There's a well known case involving a professional golfer who early in his career developed such severe anxiety around a specific type of shot, a shot put, ironically one of the technically easiest shots in the entire sport, that he began missing putts he would have made easily in practice, purely because of mental pressure of a live tournament. This phenomenon is well documented in sports psychology and even has a name: choking under pressure. And it happens precisely because excessive anxiety pulls conscious, effortful attention into a skill that should be running automatically, disrupting the smooth practice motion with clumsy, over monitored movement. What his sports psychologists worked with him on wasn't primarily about putting stroke itself, which was already technically sound. It was about a specific pre-shot routine, a fixed, unchanging sequence of physical actions performed identically before every single putt, regardless of how much pressure he felt in the moment. Walk around the ball the same way, take the same number of practice strokes, take a breath at the same point in the sequence every time. The specific content of the routine mattered less than its consistency, because a fixed routine gives an anxious mind sometimes something concrete and familiar to focus on, rather than spiraling into the abstract, catastrophic what ifs of the moment. He went on to have a highly successful career, and in later interviews he specifically credited that pre-shot routine more than any change to his actual technique with getting him through the anxious years early in his career. The parallel to your first call is direct and worth naming explicitly. A fixed pre-call routine, the same two breaths, the same opening line structure, the same brief mental check-in before you dial, serves exactly the same function as that golfer's pre-shot routine. It's not magic, it's not even really about the specific content of the routine. It's about giving your anxious mind a familiar, predictable sequence to anchor onto, rather than facing the full, undefined chaos of I have to make a scary call with no structure at all. Now, have you ever wondered why across almost every domain of human effort, the first attempt at something is disproportionately harder than every attempt that follows it, even attempts that are objectively more difficult in terms of raw skill required? This isn't unique to cold calling. It shows up in first dates, first public speeches, first days at a new job, first attempts at any physical skill, from riding a bike to skiing down a hill. There's a specific reason for this pattern, and understanding it removes a lot of the mystery and frankly a lot of the shame from why your first call feels so uniquely terrifying compared to your 15th. The reason is that your first attempt at anything carries the maximum possible uncertainty your brain has ever faced regarding that specific activity. Every subsequent attempt, no matter how difficult, benefits from at least some prior data, some template of what to expect, some evidence that you survived the activity before. Your first call is the only call in your entire life where your brain has absolutely zero direct personal evidence about what happens when you make this specific kind of call. That's the entire simple reason it feels so disproportionately hard. It's not that you are uniquely bad at it, it's that uncertainty itself, mathematically and psychologically, is at its absolute peak on attempt number one, and it decreases predictably and reliably with every subsequent attempt, almost regardless of how those attempts actually go. This is worth remembering specifically because it means the intensity of the fear you feel right now before your first call is not a permanent forecast of what every future call will feel like. It's a snapshot of the single highest uncertainty moment you will ever experience in relation to this specific activity. From here, mathematically, the uncertainty only goes down. That doesn't mean the fear vanishes entirely. We have already covered why a baseline level of activation is normal and even useful, but the peak intensity you are feeling right now in anticipation of a first call is very unlikely the worst it will ever be. Every call after this one is structurally working with less uncertainty than the one before it. Let's talk now about something a little different, a shift from the tactical to the more foundational, because I think it's one of the most powerful reframes available, and it comes from research on identity and behavior change. There's a well established finding in behavioral psychology that people are far more likely to sustain a difficult new behavior when they connect it to their identity, who they see themselves as, rather than treating it as a discrete task connected from any larger sense of self. The classic example from habit research involves smoking cessation. Someone who says, "I'm the kind of person who doesn't smoke," tends to maintain that change far more reliably than someone who says, "I'm trying to quit smoking," even though both people might be taking the exact same actions on any given day. The difference lies entirely in whether the behavior is framed as something you do or something you are. This applies directly and powerfully to your relationship with calling. Someone who thinks, "I'm trying to become someone who makes calls without fear," is fighting an uphill battle against their own self-concept every single day, because every difficult call becomes evidence against the identity they are trying to build. But someone who thinks, "I'm someone who makes calls, even the scary ones, even while afraid," has already claimed the identity before the evidence fully supports it. And here's the interesting psychological twist. Claiming an identity slightly ahead of the evidence often becomes a self-fulfilling mechanism, because your brain works hard to keep your actions consistent with the identity you have declared, a phenomenon sometimes called identity consistent behavior. This might sound like it's veering into simple positive affirmation territory, but it's actually quite different in an important way. Positive affirmation typically involves repeating a statement you don't yet believe, hoping belief eventually follows. "I am confident, I am confident, I am confident." And as we discussed earlier, this often backfires precisely because your brain notices the gap between the statement and the current evidence, and the gap itself becomes a new source of frustration. Identity based framing works differently because it's not asking you to believe you are already fearless. It's simply asking you to define yourself by the action you take, regardless of the fear present while taking it. "I'm someone who calls afraid or not" doesn't require you to deny the fear at all. It just refuses to let the fear be the deciding vote on what you do. Let's bring in one more story here, because I think it captures this identity shift particularly well, and it comes from the world of corporate leadership rather than sales specifically. There's a documented account of a woman who began her career answering phones at a call center, someone who, by her own later description in interviews, was so anxious in her first months on the job that she would sometimes let the calls ring through to voicemail rather than pick them up, simply to buy herself a few more seconds before facing the customer's frustration. She wasn't lazy or unmotivated. She describes genuinely wanting to succeed, but being paralyzed by a fear of saying the wrong thing, of being blamed for problems she hadn't caused, of disappointing someone on the other end of the line. What changed for her, according to her own account, wasn't a dramatic breakthrough moment but a specific reframe a mentor offered her fairly early on. Stop thinking of yourself as someone answering a phone and start thinking of yourself as someone solving a problem that happens to arrive by phone. That shift in identity from phone answerer to problem solver changed how she approached every single call afterward, because a problem solver isn't threatened by a frustrated customer. A problem solver is genuinely curious about what's actually wrong and how to fix it. She went on over the following 2 decades to rise through several leadership roles, eventually running a division responsible for thousands of customer interactions a day. And she said publicly more than once that the identity shift from phone answerer to problem solver was the single most important reframe of her entire career, more impactful than any specific training or script she ever learned. I want you to notice something about that story before we move forward, because it's easy to hear these accounts and think, well, that worked for her, but I'm not built that way. Here's the thing, she wasn't built that way either, not at first. She was letting calls go to voicemail out of fear just months before that reframe landed. The identity shift wasn't a discovery of some hidden natural confidence she always secretly had. It was a deliberate choice she made repeatedly to define herself by a frame that served her better than the one she had been operating under. You have exactly the same choice available to you right now regarding how you define yourself in relation to the call sitting in front of you. Let's get practical again for a moment, because I want to prepare you mentally for the actual range of responses you are likely to encounter, because uncertainty about what's coming is a huge part of the fear, and reducing that uncertainty in advance, even just conceptually, takes a real bite out of the anxiety before you even dial. There are, broadly speaking, 4 categories of response you're likely to encounter on any given call, and knowing them in advance means none of them will catch you off guard the way an unanticipated response tends to. The first and by far the most common is the neutral response. Someone who's polite but simply not interested, who says something like no thanks or not right now and ends the call quickly but without any hostility whatsoever. This is the overwhelming statistical majority of outcomes, and it's worth internalizing that fact clearly, because most beginners brace themselves primarily for the fourth category, which we will get to when in reality they will encounter this first mild neutral category far more often than anything dramatic. The second category is the curious response. Someone who has questions, who wants more information, who might not commit to anything on this call but is genuinely engaged in the conversation. This is the response that gradually becomes more common as your skill and comfort increase, because a calmer, more confident opening tends to invite curiosity rather than immediate dismissal. The third category is the enthusiastic response. Someone who's genuinely glad you called, who was perhaps already looking for exactly what you're offering. And this category, while statistically rarer than the first two, is the one that reminds you why you are doing this at all. And it's worth remembering it exists precisely because the anxious mind tends to forget positive outcomes are even possible. And the fourth category, the one almost everyone fears, most disproportionately to its actual frequency, is the harsh response. Someone who's rude, dismissive, or even hostile. This category is real and it does happen, and I'm not going to pretend it never will. But here's what's important to understand about its actual frequency compared to what much mental space it occupies in a beginner's imagination. It is statistically the rarest of the four categories in almost every context where cold calling has been studied. Most people who are unhappy simply hang up quickly, which falls into the neutral category rather than escalating into genuine hostility, because most people, most of the time, don't have the energy or the inclination to be cruel to a stranger over something this low stakes, even when they are mildly annoyed. But let's not skip past it, because I think it's more useful to prepare you for the rare harsh response than to pretend it never happens, because false reassurance tends to backfire the first time reality doesn't match it. So here's how to think about it when it does occur, because having a plan for the worst case scenario, even a rare one, removes a huge amount of its power over you in advance. The first thing worth knowing is that a genuinely hostile response almost always says more about the other person's current emotional state than it does about anything you did. People who are already having a difficult day, already stressed about something entirely unrelated to your call, sometimes discharge that unrelated frustration onto whoever happens to be on the other end of the phone in that moment, and you simply happen to be the person who called during that particular window. This isn't a comforting platitude, it's a statistically reasonable interpretation, given that you, as a stranger making a brief low stakes call, genuinely have not done anything to that person that would warrant real hostility. The math simply doesn't support "I deserve that" as the most likely explanation. They are dealing with something else entirely is almost always the more probable and more accurate read. The second thing worth knowing is a specific practical technique for the moment itself, something you can use live in real time. If you do encounter genuine hostility, it's called the low and slow response, and it's used by de-escalation trainers across fields ranging from customer service to crisis negotiation. When someone raises their voice or becomes sharp with you, the instinctive reaction is often to either match their energy defensively or to shrink and over apologize. Both tend to escalate or prolong the interaction. The low and slow technique instead has you deliberately lower your own volume slightly and slow your own pace slightly in response to their heightened energy, which has a subtle but real effect on de-escalating the interaction, because raised emotional energy on one side of a conversation often searches almost unconsciously for a matching intensity on the other side, and when it doesn't find one, it frequently deflates faster than it would have otherwise. The third thing worth knowing, and this is perhaps the most liberating piece of all, is that you are always allowed to end a call that has become genuinely abusive. This isn't a failure, this isn't giving up. A simple, calm line like "I understand you are frustrated, I'll let you go," and then actually hanging up in is a completely legitimate professional response to genuine hostility. You do not owe anyone unlimited access to your time or your composure simply because they picked up the phone. Setting that boundary calmly and without drama is itself a skill, and it's one that becomes easier with practice, exactly like everything else we have discussed today. Let's bring in a brief de-escalation story here, because I think it illustrates the low and slow principle in action clearly. There's a well documented training case from a major airline's customer service division involving an agent handling calls during a period of widespread flight cancellations, one of the most emotionally charged situations customer service representatives regularly face, because passengers calling in are often stranded, exhausted, and legitimately frustrated through no fault of the agent on the phone. One particular call, used later in internal training materials as an example of excellent de escalation, involved a passenger who opened the call already shouting, furious about a cancelled connection. The agent, instead of raising her own voice to be heard over his, or rushing to apologize repeatedly in a way that can sometimes read as insincere or panicked, did something specific and deliberate. She lowered her voice noticeably, slowed her pace, and said simply, "I hear you. This has clearly been a frustrating day. Let's see what I can do to help." She didn't argue with his anger. She didn't match it. She didn't shrink from it either. She just met it with calm, steady, unhurried presence. And within about 90 seconds, according to the training notes on this call, his volume had come down considerably, and the rest of the call proceeded as a normal, cooperative, problem solving conversation. This is the low and slow principle in action, and it's directly transferable to any harsh moment you might encounter on your own calls. Now let's talk about something that happens after the call ends, something almost nobody teaches explicitly, but which matters enormously for your ability to sustain calling activity over an entire day, week, or career, and that's the post call recovery ritual. Here's the problem this solves. After a difficult call, even a mildly uncomfortable one, let alone a genuinely harsh one, your nervous system is left in an activated state, and if you immediately move into dialing the next number without any kind of reset in between, you are essentially stacking activation on top of activation, call after call, until by the end of the day you're operating from a place of accumulated unresolved stress rather than a fresh, calm baseline each time. The post-call recovery ritual is simply a short, deliberate sequence you run through between calls, regardless of how the previous call went, specifically designed to signal to you, your nervous system, that the previous event is over and it's safe to reset. This can be remarkably brief, even 15 or 20 seconds enough to make a meaningful difference. It might include one or two of those physiological size we discussed earlier, a brief physical movement like standing up and rolling your shoulders, or a single line you say to yourself out loud, something like, "That call is done, this next one is new." The specific content matters less than the consistency of doing something every time that draws a clear boundary between the call that just ended and the one about to begin. Here's why this matters more than it might initially seem. Without a reset ritual, your brain tends to carry forward the emotional residue of the previous call into the next one, which means a single harsh call early in the day can end up coloring your tone, your confidence, and your openness on every subsequent call, even ones with completely different people who had nothing to do with that first difficult interaction. This is sometimes called emotional carryover, and it's one of the most under discussed reasons people have entire bad days after just one or two rough calls, rather than one rough call followed by an otherwise normal day. The recovery ritual interrupts that carryover before it has a chance to compound. Let's zoom out now and talk about momentum across multiple days, because everything we have discussed so far has focused heavily on the individual call, the individual moment of fear, the individual reset afterward. But fear of calling isn't really solved in a single afternoon. It's solved the way almost anything meaningful is solved, through a compounding process that unfolds across weeks and months, where each day's effort builds on the last. even when it doesn't feel like much progress is happening in the moment. Here's a specific number worth knowing because it reframes what progress actually looks like in the early stages of this kind of skill building. Research on skill acquisition across many domains consistently finds that the steepest part of any learning curve happens in the earliest repetitions, meaning your first 10 calls will feel disproportionately, almost absurdly hard than calls 50 through 60, which will themselves feel easier than calls 100 through 110. But the rate of improvement slows as you go, even though total skill keeps climbing. This has an important practical implication. The hardest days of this entire process are very likely the ones you are in right now. At the beginning, it gets easier from here, not because you will magically become a different person, but because the mathematics of the learning curve are working in your favor with every single call, even the ones that feel unsuccessful. There's a concept from habit research called the compounding effect that's worth understanding here, because it explains why day-to-day progress in something like this often feels frustratingly invisible in the moment, even while real change is happening underneath the surface. If you were to graph your comfort level with calling day by day, it wouldn't look like a smooth, steady upward line. It would look choppy with good days and bad days scattered somewhat unpredictably, especially early on. But because if you zoomed out and looked at the trend across a full month late rather than a single day, the underlying upward trajectory becomes clear even though it wasn't visible from any single day-to-day comparison. This is exactly why people who track their progress only by how did today feel often give up right before the compounding trend would have become visible to them, because a single bad day, especially one soon after several improving days, can feel like proof that nothing is working, when in reality it's simply the normal noise sitting on top of a real underlying upward trend. Let's bring in a story here about every failure preceding eventual mastery, because I think this pattern deserves its own dedicated example, distinct from the rejection volume story we covered earlier, because this one focuses specifically on the emotional experience, the early period, not just the eventual outcome. There's a widely told account from the world of professional writing involving an author whose first novel was rejected by dozens of publishers before finally being accepted. A story that gets repeated often enough that some of the specific numbers vary slightly between tellings, but the core pattern holds consistently across the more carefully documented versions. Dozens of rejections, some of them curt, some of them more detailed, but still discouraging, stretched out over a period of well over a year before an acceptance finally came in. That's notable in the author's own later descriptions of that period isn't a story of unwavering, serene confidence throughout, but by her own account, she describes real moments of despair, real consideration of giving up entirely, real tears over some of the more dismissive rejection letters. This matters because it would be dishonest and frankly unhelpful to suggest that people who eventually succeed at overcoming this kind of fear do so by feeling calm and certain the entire way through. They don't. They feel discouraged, sometimes profoundly so, and they continue anyway, not because the discouragement disappeared, but because they kept taking the next action even while the discouragement was fully present. I want to draw your attention to a specific detail in stories like this one, because it's the detail that gets skipped over most often in the version of these stories that circulates as motivational content. It's not the persistence eventually overcomes discouragement in some clean linear way where the discouragement steadily decreases until it's gone. Often the discouragement stays roughly constant or even flares back up unpredictably right up until the moment of the breakthrough. What changes isn't necessarily the discouragement itself. What changes is the person's relationship to it, their willingness to act despite its continued presence, which is again the exact same theme we started this whole discussion with, all the way back to the story of the insurance agent sitting in his car. Courage isn't the disappearance of fear or discouragement, it's action taken in their continued presence. Now, here's something worth preparing you for that almost nobody discusses, and I think it's one of the most surprising and counterintuitive parts of this entire topic: the emotional dip that often follows initial success. You would think that once you finally get a genuine yes, a real success on a call, after all this build up of fear and anticipation, the emotional experience afterward would be uncomplicated joy and relief. And often, in the very first moments, it is exactly that. But there's a pattern that shows up frequently enough in performance psychology to be worth naming explicitly: a strange letdown or anticlimax that sometimes follows shortly after a hard won success. Once the initial adrenaline settles, this has a specific mechanism behind it, and understanding it in advance prevents it from feeling confusing or alarming if it happens to you. The intense anticipatory activation we have discussed throughout this entire conversation doesn't just vanish the instant you succeed. It needs somewhere to go physiologically, and sometimes even what follows a big win is a kind of crash, a flatness, even a strange sadness as your body processes the sudden drop from high activation back down to baseline. Athletes describe this after major competitions. Performers describe it after opening nights. It's sometimes informally called the post-achievement dip, and it's a completely normal physiological pattern, not a sign that something is wrong with you, or that the achievement wasn't actually meaningful, or that you are somehow ungrateful for a success you worked hard for. Knowing this in advance matters because if you don't expect it, the dip can feel deeply confusing. You got the yes you were terrified of not getting, and instead of feeling triumphant, you feel oddly hollow or exhausted. And without context, that hollow feeling can trigger a whole new round of self doubt, wondering if something is fundamentally wrong with you for not feeling the joy you expected to feel. But if you know in advance that this dip is a common psychologically, physiologically explainable pattern, simply your nervous system settling back down from an activated state, you can meet it with curiosity rather than alarm, trusting that it will pass, usually within a day or so, without needing to mean anything deeper about your success or your capability. Let's talk now about a specific trap that catches a lot of thoughtful, conscientious people precisely because it disguises itself as diligence rather than avoidance. And we touched on a version of this earlier, but it deserves a deeper look here because of how common and how sneaky it is. It's the trap of over preparation, and here's how to recognize when preparation has quietly crossed over from useful into avoidant. Reasonable preparation has a natural point of diminishing returns. You learn the basics of what you're calling about, you have a rough sense of your opening line, you know the general shape of what you are offering and why it might matter to the person you're calling. Beyond that point, additional preparation, refining your script for the 10th time, researching the company for another hour, reading one more article about sales technique, starts to produce almost no additional actual readiness. What it does produce reliably is additional delay, and delay, as we discussed earlier, is one of the fear's favorite disguises. Here's a useful diagnostic question to ask yourself if you are not sure whether you are still in useful preparation or have slipped into avoidant over preparation. Would this next hour of preparation change anything meaningful about how the actual call goes? If the honest answer is no, or if you find yourself unable to specify exactly what new information or skill this additional preparation would add, that's a strong signal you have crossed the line from readiness to avoidance. And the next right action is simply to make the call, imperfect preparation and all. There's a well-known concept in product development and entrepreneurship that applies directly here. Sometimes summarized as done is better than perfect, or described more formally as the minimum viable version of any effort, the smallest version of a thing that's good enough to actually put into the world and learn from, rather than an idealized, fully polished version that never actually launches because it's still being refined. Your first call doesn't need a perfect script. It needs a good enough script and the willingness to dial. The refinement happens through real calls, through real feedback, not through additional hours of imagining what the call might be like. Let's bring in a quick story to anchor this, because it's a pattern that shows up constantly in business history. The entrepreneur who delays launching for months, sometimes years, refining a product that was already good enough to test in the market long before it actually launched. There's a widely cited account from the early days of a well-known technology company where the founders reportedly launched a stripped down, deliberately imperfect first version of their product specifically to start gathering real feedback rather than continuing to guess in isolation about what customers wanted. That imperfect first version, full of gaps its creators were well aware of, generated more useful information in its first month of real use than additional months of internal planning ever could have. Precisely because real contact with real customers surfaces information that no amount of internal speculation can replicate. The parallel to your first call is direct. An imperfect call made today teaches you more about what actually works than another week of refining a script in isolation. Real contact with a real person, even an uncomfortable, imperfect version of that contact, generates the specific, concrete data your brain needs to recalibrate its threat predictions in a way that no amount of additional solo preparation ever could. Now let's address something specific that trips up a lot of people. A fear category almost distinct from the fear of an actual live conversation, and that's the fear surrounding voicemail and no answer calls. This might sound strange at first. How can leaving a message for a machine be scary? But for a lot of people, it genuinely is. Sometimes even more anxiety provoking than a live conversation, and understanding why reveals something useful about the nature of this fear more broadly. Here's the mechanism. With a live conversation, you get real time feedback. You can hear tone, adjust your pace, respond to cues. With a voicemail, you're speaking into a void with no feedback at all, and you know that whatever you say is now permanently recorded, unable to be revised or clarified in the moment, sitting there for the other person to judge at their leisure on their own time without you present to explain or soften anything. This lack of real-time feedback and the permanence of the recording combine to create a specific flavor of anxiety, sometimes even sharper than live call anxiety for certain people, because it removes your ability to adjust in real time, which is one of the coping mechanisms your nervous system relies on most heavily. The practical fix here mirrors much of what we have already discussed, but it's worth naming specifically for this scenario. First, script your voicemail message in advance briefly, no more than about 20 seconds when spoken aloud, because long voicemails are rarely listened to in full and also give your anxious mind more surface area to fumble across. Second, accept in advance that your first few voicemails will probably feel awkward on playback if you ever listen back to them, and that this is completely fine, because the goal of an early voicemail isn't polish, it's simply getting comfortable with the format itself, the same exposure principle we discussed regarding live calls. Third, and this is a small but meaningful trick, smile slightly while you record your message. Even though nobody can see you, this sounds almost silly, but voice coaches and customer service trainers consistently point out that smiling measurably changes the acoustic properties of your voice, making it sound warmer and more approachable. And the person listening can hear that difference even without seeing your face. There's something worth naming about the psychology of the no answer call, specifically distinct even from voicemail, because a call that simply rings and rings with no answer at all carries its own small emotional sting for a lot of beginners. An anticlimactic frustration after having worked up the nerve to dial in the first place. Here's a helpful reframe for this specific scenario. A no answer is not a rejection at all. It's not even data about how the person feels about you or your offer, because they never even engaged with the call in the first place. It's the most neutral possible outcome that exists in this entire landscape of outcomes, closer to weather than to any kind of verdict. And yet, because it lands right after the build-up of courage required to dial, it can feel disproportionately deflating if you are not prepared for how common and how meaningless in the truest sense that particular outcome actually is. Let's widen the lens for a moment and look at this fear across different professions, entirely because I think seeing how universal this exact pattern is across contexts that have nothing to do with sales reinforces something important. This isn't a sales specific weakness or a personality flaw unique to certain people. It's a deeply human response to a specific structural situation initiating contact with an unknown outcome where rejection or difficulty is a real possibility, and that structural situation shows up across an enormous range of human activity. Consider the consider the fear a new nurse feels before making an emergency call to a physician at 2 in the morning to report a concerning change in a patient's condition, a call that could be met with irritation at being woken or dismissiveness, or in a worst case scenario, blame if something is later found to have been missed. New nurses, according to research on early career nursing anxiety, frequently describe this specific kind of call, sometimes referred to informally in nursing culture as the fear of calling the doctor, as one of the most anxiety provoking parts of their early training, often more stressful than the actual clinical skills of nursing itself, which is a striking parallel to how salespeople describe cold calling as more stressful than the actual product knowledge required for the job. There's a well documented training tool used in nursing education specifically designed to address this fear called a structured communication framework, which gives new nurses an exact template to follow when making these calls, reducing the cognitive load of the interaction in exactly the way we discussed earlier regarding the working memory demands of an unstructured first call. The framework typically includes a fixed sequence: situation, background, assessment, recommendation, spoken in that order every time, regardless of how nervous the nurse feels in the moment. Just as we discussed with the golfer's pre-shot routine, the specific content of the framework matters less than its consistency, because a fixed structure gives an anxious mind something concrete and familiar to hold on to, rather than facing the interaction with no scaffolding at all. Now, new nurses who are taught this specific structured framework according to studies on nursing communication training report significantly lower anxiety around these calls compared to nurses without a structured framework, not because the framework eliminates the inherent difficulty of the interaction, but because it removes and one entire layer of cognitive burden, the burden of figuring out in the moment how to even organize what you're trying to say, freeing up mental capacity to focus on the actual substance of the communication rather than its structure. The reason I bring this up isn't just to reassure you that other professionals face similar fears, though that reassurance has real value on its own. It's to point out that the tools we have been building throughout this entire discussion, a fixed opening structure, a pre-call breathing routine, reframing the interaction stakes accurately, a post-call recovery ritual, aren't sales gimmicks. They are general purpose tools for managing the fear of any first contact interaction with uncertain outcomes, and they have independently been developed, tested, and refined across entirely unrelated fields, from nursing to aviation to emergency dispatching, because the underlying psychological mechanism is the same everywhere it shows up. Now let's talk about a concept that reframes rejection into perhaps the most powerful way of anything we have discussed today, and it comes from a term popularized in risk analysis and later adapted broadly across psychology and performance science: anti-fragility. Most people are familiar with the idea of resilience, the capacity to withstand stress and bounce back to where you start. Anti-fragility describes something different and frankly more useful for our purposes here. Systems and people that don't just withstand stress and return to baseline, but actually become stronger, more capable, more robust, specifically because of exposure to stress and disorder, provided that exposure happens in manageable doses rather than overwhelming ones. Here's how this applies directly to your fear of the first call. A muscle doesn't grow because it avoided resistance. It grows specifically because it was exposed to resistance slightly beyond its current capacity, followed by recovery repeated over time. Your capacity to handle rejection, to handle the discomfort of an unknown outcome, to handle a stranger's dismissiveness without it derailing your entire day, works on an almost identical principle. Each call you make, especially each call that includes some discomfort or difficulty, is a small dose of resistance training for your emotional resilience. And provided you are also incorporating the recovery elements we discussed, the breathing, the post-call reset, the evidence log correcting your distorted memory, you don't just survive that resistance, you come out the other side of it slightly stronger than you were before, more capable of handling the next difficult moment, whatever form it takes. This reframe matters because it flips the entire emotional balance of a difficult call. Instead of viewing a hard no purely as something to be endured and survived, you can start to view it quite literally and accurately as a rep, a specific measurable unit of resilience training, the emotional equivalent of a rep at the gym. This doesn't mean you should seek out unnecessary hostility or treat difficult calls as something to celebrate in some falsely cheerful way, but it does mean that the discomfort itself isn't purely a cost to be minimized. It's also simultaneously an investment being made in your future capacity to handle exactly this kind of discomfort with less and less disruption to your overall functioning every single time. Here's something worth asking yourself directly, and I want you to actually consider this rather than skim past it. If every difficult call you have ever made was actually building a kind of emotional strength you can't yet fully see or measure, the same way a single day at the gym doesn't visibly change your body but contributes to a change that becomes obvious over months, would that change how you feel about the difficult calls still ahead of you? Not making them easier in the moment necessarily, but making the discomfort feel less like pure loss and more like a specific worthwhile kind of investment in who you are becoming. Before we get to perfectionism, I want to spend some time on a tool that a lot of people underestimate simply because it feels a little silly at first, and that's practicing out loud with another person before you ever pick up the real phone. This is sometimes called role play, and I know the word itself makes some people cringe a little, maybe because it conjures memories of awkward corporate training sessions. But strip away the awkward branding and the underlying mechanism in one of the most well supported tools in all of skill acquisition research, across everything from surgery to public speaking to language learning. Here's why it works so well specifically for calling anxiety. Remember the working memory problem we discussed earlier, the way your brain gets overloaded in that first 10 seconds trying to simultaneously listen, retrieve your script, monitor your own voice, and plan ahead. Role play with another person, even someone who isn't a real prospect, forces your brain to practice that exact multitasking demand, producing speech in real time while responding to another live human being's unpredictable input without the added weight of real stakes riding on the outcome. This is sometimes called low stakes rehearsal, and it's the exact same principle behind why pilots train extensively in flight simulators before ever flying a real aircraft with passengers on board. The simulator can't replicate every single variable of a real flight, but it replicates enough of the core cognitive and physical demands that the pilot's brain builds real transferable competence before the stakes become genuinely high. Here's a specific way to structure this kind of practice that tends to work well. Find a colleague, a friend, even a family member willing to play the other side of the conversation for 10 or 15 minutes. Ask them to genuinely push back, sometimes to occasionally say no, to occasionally ask a hard question rather than simply being agreeable to the whole way through. Because agreeable practice partners, while well intentioned, don't actually train you for the friction you will encounter in a real call. If you don't have a willing practice partner readily available, some people use a version of this alone, speaking their opening and their responses out loud to an empty room, which sounds strange but genuinely helps because the physical act of producing the words with your actual voice rather than only rehearsing them silently in your head engages motor memory in your speech muscles in a way that silent rehearsal simply doesn't. There's a related distinction worth understanding here between what's sometimes called a warm call and a cold call, because the fear profile of each is meaningfully different, and knowing which one you are actually facing helps you calibrate your expectations accurately. A true cold call involves reaching out to someone with no prior contact, no referral, no existing relationship of any kind, pure uncertainty, maximum novelty, exactly the scenario we have spent most of this conversation focused on. A warm call, by contrast, involves some existing thread of connection, a referral from someone they trust, a prior brief interaction, a shared connection who's already given you permission to reach out. Warm calls carry meaningfully lower baseline anxiety for most people, and there's a good reason for that. Beyond simple courtesy, the existing connection functions as a small piece of real evidence your nervous system can use in its threat prediction, reducing the size of the uncertainty gap your amygdala has to fill with imagined worst case scenarios. Here's a practical implication worth taking seriously. If you are just starting out, if you have any choice at all in how you sequence your early calls, consider deliberately front loading a few warm calls before your first true cold call, not as a way of avoiding the harder version of the task forever, but as a way of generating some early real evidence of competence before facing the higher uncertainty version of the same skill. This isn't cheating, and it isn't avoidance in the unhealthy sense we discussed earlier. Remember, avoidance becomes a problem specifically when it's indefinite and unacknowledged. Deliberately sequencing your practice from lower to higher difficulty, on the other hand, is simply good instructional design. The same principle any competent teacher uses when introducing a new skill in a logical progression, rather than throwing a complete beginner straight into the hardest possible version of a task on day one. There's a story worth mentioning here from the world of competitive debate because it illustrates the value of structured practice under real but contained pressure particularly well. There's a well-known pattern in debate coaching where new debaters are gradually exposed to increasingly difficult practice rounds, starting with supportive, low pressure practice partners and building toward full intensity mock tournaments that closely simulate real competition conditions, complete with judges, time limits, and genuine cross examination. Debate coaches have long understood, often well before the research caught up, to formalize the underlying mechanism that throwing a nervous beginner straight into a full tournament without this graduated exposure tends to produce a much worse outcome than a structured, gradually intensifying practice sequence. The beginner who's never had any low stakes rehearsal tends to freeze under the first real pressure they encounter, while the beginner who's had graduated exposure through practice rounds of increasing intensity tends to perform far closer to their actual underlying skill level because their nervous system has already encountered a version of the pressure before, even if not the exact real version. The same graduated principle applies directly to your own calling practice. Role play first if you can arrange it, warm calls next if any are available to you, true cold calls after that once you have built some real evidence and some real comfort with the physical and cognitive mechanics of the format itself. This isn't a mandatory sequence. Plenty of people succeed by diving straight into cold calls with no prior rehearsal at all, and if that's the situation you are in, everything else we have discussed in this conversation still applies and still works. But if you do have the option to build in some graduated exposure, it tends to meaningfully soften the intensity of those earliest, highest uncertainty attempts. Let's talk about perfectionism specifically now because it deserves its own dedicated section, distinct from the over preparation trap we discussed earlier. Even though the two are closely related, over preparation is about delaying the call. Perfectionism, as I want to define it here, is about the standard you hold yourself to once you are actually in the call, and it's a subtler, more insidious problem because it doesn't stop you from calling, it just makes every call feel like a failure even when it went perfectly reasonably. Here's the core distortion at the heart of perfectionism. In this context, the belief that a good call is one where you don't stumble, don't pause awkwardly, don't say don't ever sound anything less than perfectly polished and composed. It's it's if that's your standard, you are setting yourself up for a permanent unwinnable sense of failure, because virtually no human conversation, including conversations between the most skilled experienced professionals in any field, meets that standard consistently. Real conversation includes pauses, it includes filler words, it includes moments where someone has to backtrack and rephrase something. This isn't a sign of incompetence. It's simply what unscripted human speech actually sounds like, even from people who are extremely good at what they do. There's a useful distinction here between what I'll call outcome perfectionism and process perfectionism. And understanding the difference changes how you evaluate your own calls afterward. Outcome perfectionism judges a call by whether it resulted in a yes, treating anything short of that as failure, which, given the base rates we discussed earlier, guarantees near constant disappointment regardless of how skillfully the call was actually handled. Process perfectionism instead asks a more useful question: did I follow my structure? Did I stay present? Did I recover reasonably well when something unexpected happened? This standard is achievable on almost every call, regardless of outcome, and it's also the standard that actually correlates with long term improvement, because it focuses your attention on the things genuinely within your control rather than things that aren't. Let's bring in a story from the culinary world here, because I think a chef's first night running service illustrates the gap between perfectionism and genuine competence particularly well. There's a widely told account repeated in various forms across culinary training circles of a young cook's first night expediting, meaning coordinating and calling out orders during a busy dinner service, a high pressure role that requires clear, confident communication under real time pressure, with an entire kitchen depending on getting it right. By most accounts of these first nights, they go poorly in some specific noticeable way almost every single time. Tickets called in the wrong order, a mistimed dish, a moment of genuine confusion in front of an entire kitchen staff watching and waiting. What separates cooks who go on to run successful kitchens from those who don't isn't whether that first difficult night happened. It happens to virtually everyone in that role. It's whether they treated that the first rough night as evidence they weren't cut out for the position, or as simply the expected unavoidable cost of learning a genuinely difficult skill in real time under real pressure with no way to simulate the actual experience in advance. Kitchens with strong training cultures explicitly tell new expediters before their first service that the first night will likely be rough, not as a discouragement but as a normalization, removing the shock and the sense of personal failure that would otherwise attach itself to an outcome that was in reality entirely expected and unavoidable. This is worth applying directly to your own first call. If nobody tells you in advance that your first call is statistically likely to include some rough edges, a stumble, an awkward pause, maybe an ending that felt clumsier than you wanted, then when those rough edges show up, you are likely to interpret them as evidence of a personal failing rather than as the entirely expected, unavoidable texture of any first attempt at a skill this specific. I'm telling you now directly, your first call will probably have some rough edges. That's not a prediction of failure. That's simply an accurate description of what first attempts at almost anything look like, and knowing it in advance should remove a substantial amount of the sting when it happens, exactly the way the kitchen's advance warning does for new expediters. Now let's address something specific and common, a fear that sits slightly apart from the general fear of rejection, and that's the fear of being found out as new, inexperienced, or underqualified during the call itself. This is closely related to syndrome. This is closely related to imposter syndrome, which we discussed earlier, but it has a more specific, acute flavor in the context of a live call, because you are worried not just about a general sense of not belonging, but about a very particular concrete scenario, the other person asking a question you don't know the answer to, live in real time, live in real time, with no time to look it up or consult anymore. Here's the reframe that experienced professionals across almost every field eventually land on, often after enough calls have taught them this lesson the hard way. Not knowing an answer in the moment is not a crisis, and it is not evidence of incompetence. It's simply a normal feature of any real conversation about anything sufficiently complex to be worth having a conversation about in the first place. The skill isn't knowing everything, the skill is handling the moment of not knowing something gracefully, honestly, and without letting it derail your composure or your credibility. Here's a specific, simple line that works remarkably well in this exact situation, used by professionals across sales, customer service, medicine, and consulting alike. That's a great question. I don't want to guess and give you the wrong information. Let me find out and get back to you. This line does something important psychologically, both for you and for the person you are speaking with. For the person on the other's end, it signals honesty and care about accuracy, which counterintuitively often builds more trust than a confident sounding but potentially inaccurate answer would have. And for you, it removes the pressure of needing to have every answer memorized before you are allowed to make a call, which is an impossible standard that keeps a lot of beginners frozen in the over preparation trap we discussed earlier, believing they need complete mastery of every possible question before they are ready to call at all. I want to name something directly here because it's one of the more liberating facts in this entire conversation. Nobody who is good at this started out knowing everything. Every experienced professional you might admire for their composure on calls went through an early period where they didn't know things, got asked questions they couldn't answer, and had to say some version of "let me find out and get back to you," probably dozens or hundreds of times before their actual knowledge base caught up to the confidence of their delivery. The confidence came first, built on structure and practice, and the comprehensive knowledge followed later, accumulated call by call, question by question, exactly the same order in which you're going to build it to. Let's talk about scripts now, because there's a genuine tension worth addressing directly, one that a lot of beginners feel intuitively but rarely see named clearly. The tension between wanting a script for security and knowing where somewhere in the back of your mind that overly rigid scripts often make calls sound stiff, robotic, and unnatural, which can create its own kind of discomfort both for you and for the person listening. Here's how to think about this tension productively rather than getting stuck on either extreme. The script that meant to be read verbatim, word for word, tends to fail for a specific reason. It doesn't account for the other person's actual responses, and the moment they say something even slightly unexpected, a rigid word for word script leaves you with nothing to fall back on except panic, because you have memorized specific words rather than a flexible structure. This is why word for word scripts ironically often increase anxiety rather than decreasing it, despite feeling safer on paper, because before the call begins, what works better and what most experienced callers eventually converge on regardless of their industry, is a structural outline rather than a verbatim script. A clear sense of the key points you need to hit in a rough order, expressed in your own natural words rather than memorized phrases, with enough flexibility built in that you can adapt fluidly to whatever the other person actually says, rather than trying to force the conversation back onto a track that assumed they would respond in a particular way. This is closely related to the opening framework we discussed earlier: name, reason, permission, which is a structural outline, not a verbatim script, precisely because it survives contact with an unpredictable real human being on the other end. Let's bring in a business story here that illustrates this shift from rigid script to flexible structure particularly well. There's a widely discussed account from the early growth period of a well-known software company where the founder initially insisted that his sales team follow a tightly scripted pitch word for word. Notice that conversion rates were disappointing, and more specifically, that customers on calls seemed to sense something artificial or stilted about the interactions, often disengaging noticeably the moment the rep launched into clearly memorized language. After experimenting with loosening the requirement, giving reps a structural outline of key points to cover rather than exact wordings, and explicitly encouraging them to respond naturally to what customers actually said rather than redirecting back to a memorized script, conversion rates improved meaningfully, and the reps themselves reported feeling noticeably less anxious on calls because they were no longer holding two competing tasks in their head simultaneously. That was remembering exact wording and also genuinely listening to what the other person was saying. This is a subtle more but important point worth dwelling on for a moment, because it explains part of why rigid scripts increase anxiety in a way that's not obvious at first. When you are trying to recall exact memorized wording, a meaningful portion of your attention gets consumed by that recall task itself, leaving less attention available for actually listening to the other person, which then makes you more likely to miss cues, more likely to feel caught off guard by responses your script didn't anticipate, and more likely to freeze when the conversation departs from your expected script. A flexible structure, by contrast, frees up that attention for genuine attention, which somewhat paradoxically tends to make the entire interaction feel less effortful and less anxiety provoking, even though it might feel scarier on paper before the call begins, precisely because it doesn't offer the illusion of total control that a memorized script promises. Before we move toward bringing everything together, I want to spend some time on a tool that gets misunderstood constantly, and because it's misunderstood, most people either dismiss it entirely or use a version of it that doesn't actually work, and that tool is visualization. Earlier in this conversation, we talked about why simple positive thinking, repeating "I am confident" without real evidence behind it, tends to backfire, because your brain notices the gap between the statement and reality. Visualization sounds similar on the surface, and a lot of people assume it's just a more elaborate version of same flawed technique. But research on how elite performers actually use visualization reveals something more specific and more useful than simply imagining success in a vague, feel-good way. Here's the distinction. What the distinction that matters: ineffective visualization imagines only the outcome. Picture yourself successful, confident, closing the deal, hearing a happy yes. This version tends not to help much, and some research even suggests it can slightly undermine motivation, because your brain gets a small hit of satisfaction from imagining the reward without having done any of the actual work to earn it. A phenomenon sometimes described as the difference between outcome simulation, and process simulation. Effective visualization, the kind used by surgeons rehearsing a difficult procedure or athletes preparing for a specific competitive scenario, focuses instead on the process, imagining the specific concrete sensory detail, the actual sequence of the difficult moment itself, including the discomfort, the possible obstacles, and specifically how you will respond to them. Here's what this looks like. In practice for a call, rather than imagining a vague, pleasant future where the call went well, you instead walk through the specific sequence in detail. You imagine picking up the phone, you imagine your voice as you deliver your opening line, you imagine the possibility of an awkward pause, and specifically imagine using a bridging phrase to move through it smoothly. You imagine the possibility of a no, and specifically imagine writing your one factual sentence in your evidence log afterward, calm and unbothered. This kind of detailed process focused visualization, sometimes called mental rehearsal, primes the same neural pathways that will actually be used during a real event, giving your brain a kind of dry run that measurably reduces the surprise and overwhelm of encountering those same moments for real later. There's a specific reason this works at a neurological level worth understanding. Briefly, brain imaging research on mental rehearsal has found that imagining an action activates many of the same motor and cognitive regions that would be active during the actual physical performance of that action, though at a lower intensity. This is why visualization genuinely builds a kind of readiness, not through vague hope but through literal neural rehearsal of the specific sequence you're preparing for. The key ingredient that separates effective visualization from wishful daydreaming is specificity. Imagining the actual difficult moments and your actual planned response to them, not just imagining a pleasant ending with none of the difficulty in between. Now let's shift for a moment to something relevant if you are in a position of any kind of leadership or team responsibility, even informally, because everything we have discussed so far has focused on the individual experience of this fear. But fear also has a social and cultural dimension worth addressing directly, because the environment someone is calling within has a measurable effect on how much that fear gets amplified or eased. There's a well documented body of research on what's called psychological safety within teams, originally developed in the context of studying hospital surgical teams and later extended broadly across many other fields including sales organizations. Psychological safety describes a team culture where people feel safe admitting mistakes, asking questions, and taking interpersonal risks without fear of embarrassment or punishment from their peers or their leaders. Teams with high psychological safety consistently outperform teams with low psychological safety on complex, uncertain tasks and cold calling. Despite its surface simplicity, it is exactly this kind of uncertain, socially risky task where psychological safety matters enormously. Here's what it looks like in practice, and it's worth knowing whether you are managing others or simply hoping to advocate for a healthier culture around you. Teams with low psychological safety around calling tend to treat rejection publicly as something slightly shameful. A missed call gets noted with a raised eyebrow, a rough call gets mentioned sarcastically in front of others, and new team members quickly learn to hide their struggles rather than voice them, which ironically makes the struggles worse and slower to resolve, because isolation and secrecy tend to amplify anxiety rather than reduce it. Teams with high psychological safety around calling tend to do close to the opposite. Rejections get discussed openly, sometimes even with dark humor. Some difficult calls get shared as learning moments rather than embarrassments, and newer members are explicitly told, often by senior members who remember their own early struggles vividly, that the fear and the rough early calls are normal, expected, and nothing to hide. There's a specific practice some of the strongest sales and customer facing teams use that's worth mentioning here, sometimes informally called the worst call of the week ritual, where team members voluntarily share their most difficult or most embarrassing call from the previous week in a team meeting, often to genuine laughter and camaraderie rather than judgment. This might sound like it would make things worse, deliberately dwelling on the hardest moments, but it does something important precisely because it's voluntary and framed with warmth rather than criticism. It publicly normalizes the fact that even the most experienced, successful people on the team still have rough calls regularly, which directly counters the isolating belief that a difficult call is evidence of unique personal failure rather than simply a normal universal texture of work itself. If you are in a position to influence a team's culture, even informally, this is worth considering. And if you are not in that position but you recognize that your own environment tends toward the low safety pattern where struggles get hidden rather than shared, it's worth deliberately seeking out at least one person, even outside your immediate team, with whom you can be honest about the difficulty of this work, because isolation tends to make every single tool we have discussed today harder to apply consistently, while even a small amount of shared honesty about the difficulty tends to make all of it easier. Now, as we start moving toward drawing all of this together, I want to spend a moment on something that ties back directly to where we began this entire conversation, because I think it deserves to be revisited with everything we have now covered layered on top of it. Remember the insurance agent sitting in his car for an hour, hand on the door handle, telling himself just 5 more minutes over and over. At the time we first told that story, it was meant simply to introduce the idea that courage isn't the absence of fear. Now, with everything we have discussed about the neuroscience of threat prediction, the anxiety curve that peaks before an event and drops once it begins, the value of a fixed opening structure, the reframing of arousal as excitement, the base rates of rejection, the anti-fragile nature of exposure to difficulty. Now that story means something more specific and more actionable than it did at the start. That agent's eye in the car wasn't a personal failing unique to him. It was his amygdala running exactly the threat prediction process we described, filling in an information vacuum with worst case imagined scenarios exactly the way yours does before your own first call. The moment he got out of the car wasn't a moment where the fear disappeared. It was a moment where he acted despite the fear's continued presence, generating the first real data point his nervous system needed to begin recalibrating what a cold call to a stranger actually meant. He first His first two rejections weren't failures. They were exactly the statistically expected default outcome of a numbers game. Two flips of a coin landing on the common side. And his eventual yes and the decades of success that followed were built entirely on his willingness to keep flipping that coin, call after call, rejection after rejection, each one adding to an accumulating body of real evidence that gradually, reliably replaced the imagined catastrophe his mind that had constructed with a far more manageable, far more accurate picture of reality. Before we get fully concrete, I want to talk about something that matters more than it might seem at first glance. And that's how you treat your own milestones along the way, because how you mark progress shapes whether you keep going long enough for the compounding effect we discussed earlier to actually take hold. Here's a pattern worth watching for in yourself. When people finally get their first genuine yes after a stretch of fear and rejection, there's a common tendency to barely acknowledge it, to move on further almost immediately to the next task. Sometimes even to downplay it internally with thoughts like that one was probably just luck, or that doesn't really count. They were already interested before I called. This tendency has a name in psychological research on achievement and motivation. It's related to a broader pattern, sometimes called discounting positive evidence, where people often, without noticing they are doing it, apply a much higher bar of scrutiny to evidence that supports a positive view of themselves than they apply to evidence that supports a negative one. Recall the single data point trap we discussed earlier regarding rejection. 1. No gets treated as sweeping proof of incompetence. Discounting works in the opposite direction. On the positive side, one yes gets treated as a fluke, requiring far more evidence before it's allowed to update your self-concept in a favorable direction. This asymmetry is worth naming explicitly because it means your mind is by default biased towards accumulating evidence of failure quickly while resisting evidence of success stubbornly, and left unchecked, that asymmetry can make it feel like nothing is ever really improving even while real measurable progress is happening. The corrective here is deliberate, active acknowledgement of milestones, and it doesn't need to be elaborate or performative. It simply needs to counteract the natural discounting tendency by treating genuine progress as genuine progress rather than immediately explaining it away. Your first call ever, regardless of outcome, deserves acknowledgement because it represents the single highest uncertainty attempt you will ever make in this specific activity, exactly as we discussed earlier. Your first genuine yes deserves acknowledgement, not with expensive fanfare necessarily, but with an honest, deliberate pause to actually let it register as real evidence of real capability rather than immediately explaining it away as luck or circumstance. Some people find it useful to keep a running list separate from the plain factual evidence log we discussed earlier, specifically of milestones: first call made, first yes received, first difficult objection handled smoothly, first time recovering gracefully from a mid-call freeze, because looking back at that list during a discouraging stretch provides exactly the kind of concrete, undiscountable evidence that counters the mind's natural bias towards focusing on what's still going wrong. There's something worth saying here about the relationship between how much a particular call scares you and how much it might end up mattering to you, because there's an interesting pattern that shows up repeatedly across many of the stories we have discussed today, one worth naming directly rather than leaving implicit. The calls people remember most vividly years later, the ones that turn out in retrospect to have mattered most to their careers or their businesses or their lives, are disproportionately often the calls that scared them the most going in, not the easy, comfortable ones. This isn't a coincidence, and it isn't some mystical law of the universe rewarding bravery. There's a fairly straightforward explanation available once you think about it structurally. Calls that feel higher stakes, higher uncertainty, more intimidating tend to be exactly the calls involving people, opportunities, or conversations that matter more in the first place. The fear isn't a random, meaningless, static noise layered on top of ordinary events. It's often, in a rough and imperfect way, tracking something real about the actual stakes involved, which is precisely why avoiding the scariest calls tends to mean avoiding some of the most consequential opportunities available to you, while the easy, comfortable calls you never feared in the first place were rarely the ones that would have changed much of anything either way. I don't want to overstate this pattern into some kind of universal law. Plenty of terrifying calls turn out to be completely unremarkable in retrospect, and plenty of easy, comfortable calls turn out to matter enormously in ways nobody could have predicted in advance. But it's worth holding loosely as a general tendency because it offers one more reason, beyond everything else we have discussed, to lean into the calls that scare you most rather than quietly avoiding them in favor of easier, less intimidating ones. The fear, uncomfortable as it is sometimes a rough, unreliable, but not entirely useless signal that something real and worthwhile is on the other end of that particular call. Let's get very concrete now, because I want to leave you with something you can actually act on this week, not just interesting ideas to think about. Here's what I would suggest laid out as a simple sequential plan, drawing together the specific tools we have covered across this entire conversation. For today or for the next time you have a call sitting in front of you, start with the 2-minute rule. Don't commit to the whole call. Commit only to dialing. Before you dial, run through two physiological sighs. One normal breath in, a second short breath stacked on top, then a long, slow exhale through your mouth twice. As you dial, relabel whatever physical sensation you're feeling as excitement rather than anxiety. Out loud if you are able to. Use the name, reason, permission, opening structure delivered at a pace about 20% slower than feels natural, with your pitch falling rather than rising at the end of your first sentence. After the call, whatever happened, write one plain factual sentence in your evidence log, not an interpretation, just what actually occurred. Run a brief post-call recovery ritual before moving to the next call. Even if it's just 20 seconds of standing up and taking another breath. If the call didn't go the way you wanted, catch whatever explanation your mind reaches for first, and if it's global, permanent and internal, I'm bad at this, deliberately swap it for something specific, temporary and external, even if you're not fully certain it's true, because it's the statistically more reasonable interpretation from a single data point regardless. For this week specifically, set up one piece of social accountability if you don't already have it. Someone who will ask you directly whether you made your calls today. Set a specific implementation intention for when you will make your first call each day, tied to a specific time and trigger rather than a vague intention to get to it sometime, and measure your success at least for this week purely by attempts made, not outcomes achieved, because attempts are entirely within your control and outcomes are not. For this month, consider recording a handful of your calls if your context allows for it, and review them using the two-pass method we discussed. First, listening entirely for what went well, only afterward listening for one specific actionable thing to improve. Track your comfort level loosely, maybe with a simple daily number from 1 to 10, not because the day-to-day number will show a clean upward trend, but because looking back across several weeks will reveal the underlying compounding progress that isn't visible from any single day in isolation. And underlying all of this, the one shift I would encourage you to hold on to longer than any specific tactic. Define yourself starting today as someone who makes the call afraid or not, rather than someone who is trying to become someone who isn't afraid. That single reframe, more than any breathing technique or opening line, is actually is what actually carries people through the entire arc of this fear, from the first terrifying call all the way to the point months or years down the road where making a call barely registers as an event worth being afraid of at all. Before we bring this all the way home, I want to spend a little time on something that I think gets overlooked in most discussions of this topic, and it's the question of whether this fear looks the same in everyone, because it doesn't. And understanding your own particular flavor of it helps you apply everything we have discussed in a way that actually fits you, rather than following a generic template that might not match your specific experience. Research on temperament and personality suggests that people who lean more introverted tend to experience the fear of a first call somewhat differently than people who lean more extroverted, and neither pattern is better or worse, just different in its texture. For more introverted people, the fear often centers less on the social judgment itself and more on the sheer energy cost of unscripted real-time social interaction with a stranger, an activity that tends to be more genuinely depleting for introverted nervous systems, which draw energy more often more from internal reflection than from external stimulation. If this describes your experience, the post-call recovery ritual we discussed earlier matters even more for you specifically, and you might benefit from batching your calls into a defined block followed by real deliberate downtime afterward, rather than spreading them thinly across an entire day with no true recovery period built in. For more extroverted people, the fear often centers less on the depleting nature of the interaction itself, which tends to feel more energizing for extroverted temperaments, and more specifically on the fear of judgment or awkwardness in front of another person, sometimes compounded by a tendency to overthink how the interaction is being perceived in real time. If this sounds more like you, the reframe around personalization we discussed earlier, recognizing that a no is almost never actually about you, tends to be especially useful because extroverted anxiety is in this context often stems specifically from an inflated sense of how much the other person is actually scrutinizing you, when in reality most people on the other end of a call are thinking about their own day, their own problems, and barely registering you as an individual at all beyond the specific content of what you are saying. There's also a meaningful difference worth naming between people who tend toward general anxiety as a broader life pattern and people for whom this specific fear is fairly isolated to calling situations alone. If your anxiety about calling exists within a broader pattern of anxiety that shows up across many different areas of your life, work, relationships, health, finances, the tools we have discussed today will still help with the specific calling situation, but they are not a substitute for addressing that broader pattern, and it's worth having an honest conversation with a doctor or therapist about that broader picture, separate from anything specific to cold calling. If, on the other hand, this fear is fairly contained to calling situations specifically and doesn't reflect a broader pattern of anxiety across your life, then the tools we have covered today are likely to be sufficient on their own, because you are dealing with a specific learnable skill gap rather than a more pervasive pattern that tends broader support. I raise this distinction not to diagnose you. That's not something I'm able to do, and it's not the purpose of this conversation, but simply to point out that self-awareness about which category you fall into helps you calibrate your expectations appropriately. Someone dealing with an isolated situation specific fear should expect meaningful improvement within weeks of consistent practice using the tools we have discussed. Someone dealing with a broader anxiety pattern might find these tools genuinely helpful for calling specifically, while still needing additional separate support for the wider pattern, and there's no shame whatsoever in that being the case. Fear of calling sits on a spectrum, and where you fall on that spectrum matters for how you should think about your own timeline and what additional support might serve you well. Let's also touch briefly on how this fear tends to shift across a career or a life, because it's not static even within a single person. Over time, it's common and worth normalizing for someone who has genuinely overcome most of their fear around calling in one context, say an established role they have held for years, to help to feel a fresh wave of what same fear return almost from scratch when they change industries, take on a new type of call they haven't done before, or step into a more senior role that involves higher stakes conversations they haven't yet built comfort with. This isn't a regression or a sign that the earlier progress wasn't real. It's simply the uncertainty principle we discussed earlier reappearing in a new context, because your nervous system once again has limited direct evidence about this specific new variant of the activity, even though it has substantial evidence about the general activity of calling itself. Knowing this in advance matters because it prevents a particular kind of discouragement that catches experienced people off guard. The sense of "I thought I was past this" when a new context brings some of the old fear rushing back. You're not past it in some permanent universal sense, because fear doesn't work that way, attaching itself once to a specific skill and then vanishing forever regardless of context. But you are carrying forward every tool, every piece of self knowledge, every reframe we have discussed today, and applying those tools to a new context tends to compress the adjustment period dramatically compared to your new first experience with this fear back when none of these tools were yet part of your toolkit at all. Let's talk briefly about what happens further down the road past the early weeks and months, because there's a specific phase almost everyone hits eventually that's worth naming in advance so it doesn't catch you off guard: the plateau. After the initial steep improvement of the early learning curve we discussed earlier, most people hit a stretch where progress seems to stall out almost entirely, where calls feel neither dramatically better nor worse than they did weeks before, and where the sense of forward momentum that carried you through the early period starts to feel absent. Here's what's actually happening during a plateau, and it's worth understanding clearly, because plateaus are one of the most common reasons people abandon a skill right before a further breakthrough would have occurred. Skill development across almost every domain that's been studied rigorously doesn't follow a smooth, continuously rising curve. It follows a stepped pattern with periods of visible improvement followed by periods of apparent stagnation, where the underlying skill is often still developing quietly beneath the surface, even though it isn't yet visible in your performance. This is sometimes described in skill acquisition research as consolidation, a period where your nervous system is integrating and stabilizing the gains from the previous stretch of rapid improvement before the next visible jump becomes possible. The practical implication here is simple but important. A plateau is not evidence that you have hit some permanent ceiling, or that the tools we have discussed have stopped working, or that you were never actually improving to begin with. It's an expected normal phase of the exact same learning process that got you this far already. The people who break through plateaus aren't the ones who found some radically different technique nobody else knew about. They are Overwhelmingly the ones who simply kept showing up, kept making calls, kept trusting the process even during the stretch where it didn't feel like anything was happening, until the next visible jump in comfort and skill eventually arrived, often somewhat suddenly, the way these stepped improvements tend to. Now let's bring everything together, because we have covered an enormous amount of ground across this conversation, and I want to make sure the core threads are woven together clearly before we close. The fear you feel before your first call is not a personal defect, it's an ancient threat detection system built for a world of small tribes where social rejection meant real physical danger. Misfiring on a modern low stakes activity, it was never designed to evaluate accurately. That system updates itself through real experience, not through willpower, not through positive thinking, which is exactly why action has to come from confidence before confidence, never the other way around. The anticipation of the call is almost always worse than the call itself, because anxiety peaks before an event begins and drops sharply once it's underway, which means the very worst moment you will ever feel about this entire activity is very likely the moment right before your very first attempt. Your body has tools available to it in that moment: a pair of long, slow exhales, a deliberate relabeling of arousal as excitement rather than dread that can shift your physiological state within seconds, not because they are magic, but because they work directly with the actual mechanics of your nervous system rather than fighting against them. A single rejection is not meaningful data, it's the statistically expected default outcome of a numbers game. No more a referendum on your worth than a coin landing on tails in is a referendum on the coin. How you explain a setback to yourself afterward, specific, temporary and external rather than global, permanent and internal, determines whether you recover in seconds or spiral for the rest of the day. And that explanatory habit, like any habit, is trainable with deliberate practice. Structure beats willpower every time, whether that's a fixed opening line, a pre-call breathing routine and implementation intention set in advance, or a post-call recovery ritual that draws a clear boundary between what just happened and what's coming next. And underneath all of the specific tactics sits the single deepest reframe of this entire conversation. Courage was never the absence of fear, it was always action taken in fear's continued presence, exactly the way that insurance agent decades ago got out of his car with his hands still shaking and walked in anyway. I want to leave you with one more way of looking at all of this, a kind of zoomed out view of what a career or a life built around this specific willingness actually looks like over the long run, because I think it's easy in the middle of the fear itself to lose sight of just how much is actually riding on this one small repeatable act of picking up the phone. Think about the specific shape of a life where someone consistently, reliably makes the calls other people avoid. Not recklessly, not without preparation, not without care for the person on the other end, but consistently across weeks and months and years, willing to reach out first, even when the outcome is uncertain, even when the fear hasn't fully gone away. The specific willingness compounds in ways that are almost impossible to see clearly from any single day, but become unmistakable across a longer arc of time. Relationships get built that wouldn't exist otherwise. Opportunities surface that were only ever available to the person willing to ask. Businesses get funded, deals get closed, patients get properly treated because someone made the call at 2 in the morning instead of waiting until a more comfortable hour. Careers advance specifically because someone was willing to reach out to a person one level removed from where their networking would have naturally, comfortably ended. None of that requires becoming a fundamentally different person than you are right now. It doesn't require the fear disappearing, waiting for some future version of yourself who feels calm and certain before you're allowed to begin. It only requires the simple single act repeated that we have been discussing this entire time. Picking up the phone while the fear is still there and dialing anyway. Everything else, the skill, the comfort, the confidence, the results follows from that repeated act in exactly that order, never the reverse. I also want to say something honest before we close, because I don't want to leave you with the impression that this becomes effortless forever once you have internalized everything we have covered today. There will likely be days, even years from now, long after this fear has become genuinely manageable, where a particular call still carries a flicker of that old nervous energy, a higher stakes conversation, an unfamiliar type of call, a person whose response genuinely matters more to you than most. That flicker isn't a sign you have failed to fully overcome this. It's a sign you're still a normal human being with a normal nervous system, engaging in an activity that matters to you. The goal was never to reach a state of complete, permanent fearlessness. The goal was always to build a relationship with that flicker where it no longer gets the final vote on whether you act. So here's where we land. After everything we have covered across these last few hours, the fear you feel before your first call is real, it's explainable, it's shared by nearly everyone who has ever attempted this specific kind of first contact, from insurance agents in the 1930s to founders raising money in the 2010s to new nurses making their first overnight call to a physician. It is not a sign that you are uniquely unsuited for this. It is the completely ordinary, predictable output of an ancient threat detection system meeting a modern, low stakes activity it was never built to correctly evaluate. You now have specific, concrete tools for the moment right before you dial. The psychological sigh, the relabeling of arousal as excitement, the fixed opening structure that reduces the cognitive load of that critical first 10 seconds. You have tools for what happens during the call, including bridging phrases for the mid call freeze, and the low and slow technique for the rare, genuinely hostile response. You have tools for after the call, including the evidence log that corrects your distorted memory of what actually happened, and the post-call recovery ritual that prevents one difficult call from bleeding into the next. You understand the base rates, which mean a no was never meant to be treated as a personal verdict, and you understand the compounding stepped nature of skill development, which means the discouraging plateau you might hit somewhere down the road is not evidence that you have stopped improving, but a normal, expected phase of the exact same process that got you this far. And underneath all of it, the identity shift that matters more than any single tactic. You are someone who makes the call, not someone who is waiting to become fearless before you're allowed to begin. Someone who acts consistently in fear's continued presence, the same way every person in every story we have told today did, long before they became the version of themselves other people now look up to. Your first call is waiting for you whenever you are ready to make it, and I mean that literally. Not some future calmer version of you months from now, after more preparation, after more research, after the fear has supposedly subsided. This version of you right now, exactly as anxious and exactly as prepared as you currently are, is fully capable of making that call today. The data your nervous system needs in order to start recalibrating everything we have discussed can only come from one place, and that's a real call made by the real, currently a little scared version of you, not some idealized future version who's already overcome it. So pick a name, pick a number, set your timer if that helps. Run through your 2 breaths, relabel the feeling in your chest as excitement rather than dread, and dial while the fear is still there, because it's always going to still be there right up until the exact moment you decide to act anyway. If this episode gave you something useful, a reframe that landed, a tool you're planning to actually use on your very next call, a story that stuck with you, I would genuinely love for you to pass it along to someone else who's sitting exactly where you were at the start of this conversation, hand hovering over their phone, telling themselves just 5 more minutes. Subscribe now if you haven't already. Follow along for the next episode, and if you found real value here, leave a review, because it helps this reach the next person who needs exactly what you just heard. Until next time, go make the call.